Here we go. Okay, so everyone should have heard that. We are now recording. So welcome everybody to TAG meeting number 4 for the Flagstaff Regional Plan update for the scenario planning work. By now, meeting 4, probably I'm a familiar face to most of you, but if not, my name is Sachi Arakawa. I am one of the consultants with Cascadia Partners. We're leading the scenario planning work in partnership with the city and county for the regional plan. I'm joined by Alex Steinberger and Ayano Healy, my 2 colleagues who you'll be hearing from and in discussion with at various parts of this meeting today. So we are also joined by city and county staff. So maybe for all of the team that I just mentioned, if you want to just put your name and a little hello in the chat for folks to see who you are. And then I will continue forward here. So this is our agenda for today. We'll have welcome and meeting logistics that Sarah will share in just a moment. Then we are spending the bulk of this 2 hours that we have together in discussion. So we're really looking forward to like rolling up our sleeves and having a discussion together about some of the concepts that we've been talking about over the last few TAG meetings. So we're going to give you a short presentation about the growth principles and growth ideas that we've been talking about as a way to remind you of those things. And then we're diving into the discussion. First, we're going to talk about the growth ideas. We'll have almost an hour to do that. We're going to do what I think should be a pretty fun map-based activity. We, the Cascadia staff, will be facilitating and leading you through that map activity. So don't worry, no technical expertise required. You don't have to use any tools. The only thing we ask is just that folks be somewhere that you can hopefully view a screen and look at the map that we'll be sharing, and also be able to unmute and share ideas, or at the very least contribute thoughts via the chat. Then we'll take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and do a group report back for about 40 minutes. So we'll have a good amount of time to do a group discussion about the growth ideas and growth principles all together. And then we'll adjourn, talk about next steps, and we'll finish up around noon. All right, so I'm going to pass this along to Sarah Dector to do our land acknowledgement and a few other meeting agenda details.
Sachi, and thanks everyone. The City of Flagstaff begins meetings like this with our Indigenous land acknowledgement. The City of Flagstaff humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of this area's Indigenous nations and original stewards. These lands, still inhabited by Native descendants, border mountains sacred to Indigenous peoples. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home. And so with that, I want to welcome everyone to this, our 4th meeting of the Technical Advisory Group for Scenario Planning. We have gotten to a major point in our process where we're kind of into the actual elbows deep work that I hope we can accomplish in this meeting today. So thank you everyone for making a little more time on your schedule for this meeting and for arriving promptly. And I think, would you mind going to the next slide? So just to review for everyone, the TAG purpose is to advise the city and county staff, myself and Jess and Jenny and Jordan, some other folks are here to be advised, but also indirectly the whole team on the assumptions, data, and methods appropriate for both engaging the community on scenario planning and for making sure the outcome builds the future that the region needs to be resilient and equitable. We don't have a quorum requirement for this group. We haven't had a meeting without a quorum yet, though, and I am very grateful for everyone's commitment to that in our process. So Our commitment as staff is, of course, that these are transparent and open dialogues. We do share them on this project website and make available feedback forms so community members can give feedback on how we're doing as a group and the service that we're providing to this project. So we are, of course, also posting meeting agendas and other information to our website. And we want to ensure that everyone has adequate airtime today. So there's a breakout room portion, and we ask you to, both in the bigger Zoom room and in the breakout rooms, speak openly and listen respectfully. And I think that's my last slide, so I'll hand it back to Sachi.
Great, thank you, Sarah. All right, sorry. You caught me in a moment with a snack in my mouth, but I'm done.
I was faster than anticipated.
You were so fast.
Today.
I thought I had a snack break, but I was wrong. I underestimated your ability to speak succinctly. All right, well, that's great. So since we are going to have quite a bit of discussion, I wanted to set a little bit of context and background in the growth principles and growth ideas that we shared with you last time, and how these growth principles and growth ideas get us to our end goal, which is creating the scenarios. So first, I'll share again the growth ideas that we shared with you all last time and talked briefly about. We did a little bit of kind of like in Zoom meeting, surveying you about which one of these sounded interesting to you. We described a little bit about each one, but we're really looking today, again, to roll up our sleeves and dig a little deeper into these and get more feedback, actually look at some maps and zoom around and say, what would all of these different growth ideas really look like on the ground? And these were created through the Face the Future Flagstaff workshops, which have happened not long ago. So they're all grounded in public feedback, as well as, sort of ground truth with staff and other important stakeholders like yourself, and in this process that we're having together today. And they happened, or the way that they happened in the Face the Future workshops was that we were asking people to respond to an uncertain future. So things like the potential for climate change to impact us in a variety of ways, differing levels of funding for infrastructure, and the amount of new population and jobs that we might see in the future. These are all things that are unknown, but that these ideas kind of react to the unknown nature of. So these growth ideas are also supplemented by growth principles, or maybe complemented by, or they work together with growth principles. These growth principles came from a process that happened kind of concurrently with the Face the Future Flagstaff workshops, where Sarah and Melissa and city and county staff got together and looked at recent and past planning documents, like the last regional plan and and the results from the visioning workshops for the regional plan update, and pulled together a set of growth principles that came from that planning work, that can inform different ideas about growth or principles about growth. We came up with 23 total, or pulled 23 in total from those previous planning efforts. And we put out a survey that asked the public to prioritize those growth principles. The survey was out for about a month, 5 weeks, from May 2nd to June 2nd. We had about 328 respondents, so pretty good amount of people interacting with this work. And these were the results of the survey. So these were the sort of top 5 ranked growth principles that the public thought were important. So preserving natural areas with high ecological values, minimizing water use and planning for water conservation, mitigating traffic congestion, maximizing the availability of affordable workforce housing, and limiting the expansion of the wildland-urban interface. So this is the results of the survey. Obviously, we have a larger list of growth principles, but these were ones that the public indicated were of particular importance. So how do these growth ideas and growth principles actually feed into the scenarios that we want to create? Here's kind of a diagrammatic explanation of how that works. So again, we have two components, growth ideas and growth principles here shown at the top. Growth ideas are, again, specific concepts for where growth would occur. So they have kind of a specific spatial component. You could almost like sketch them out on a map. And they have kind of very specific ideas that they describe. And then growth principles are a little more high level. They're general values and vision that's carried forward from the regional plan, from the previous regional planning efforts and visioning that also inform how growth should happen. So these two components go into a scenario theme. A scenario theme is a set of instructions for creating a scenario that describes a concept for future growth, and again, is informed by these growth ideas and growth principles. The scenario theme, essentially sort of the blueprint for the scenario, then becomes and informs the scenario. The scenario in its final version depicts a refined concept for future growth, and that is an alternative to the business as usual scenario. So you all have had a little bit of a chance to be introduced to business as usual, or kind of what would happen in a scenario if nothing that we are currently doing really changed. These scenarios that we will be creating are alternatives to that. In its final sort of version, a scenario has three key components: a narrative, a map, and performance metrics. So we can rank the scenario or evaluate the scenario based on how it performs on different metrics, like perhaps VMT, or how it impacts our economy and our tax base. So that kind of gives you a sense of how these growth ideas and growth principles will eventually feed into the final scenarios, and why it's so important, and how they're very foundational to the creation of the scenario. So it's really important that we vet them and that we hear from our local stakeholders about, to make sure that they sound right and realistic to what we're seeing in the region. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Ayano Healy, who's going to set us up for the discussion that we will be having together shortly.
Yeah, thanks, Sachi. Okay, so like it's already been mentioned today, the bulk of this meeting is going to be us doing some great discussion work in breakout rooms. We're going to pull out some maps and dive more into specific growth ideas and what they might look like, the nuance and details and growth for that particular growth idea. So let's just review before we do kind of what we meant when we kind of characterize these 6 different concepts, starting with the rural activity centers. So this was came from feedback that from the Face the Future Flagstaff workshops that kind of participants placed a lot of growth in more rural activity centers. So this growth idea emphasizes housing and jobs around the Belmont, Donny Park, Kachina Village, and Mountainair and Winona activity centers in particular, and making better transportation links between them. I know that there are some recent area plans that have kind of been set forth with Belmont and Donny Park. So that'll be really interesting for those who are familiar, or at least for us to kind of talk about more once we get into breakout rooms. The next growth idea is our urbanized Flagstaff Greenfield sites. And so this one came up from a lot of attention we saw through the workshop feedback around the John Wesley Powell area and the new hospital development site. And so this growth idea would be us talking about how could we develop those around those areas to become more relatively dense, having mixed uses and perhaps becoming more of a regional activity center. Okay, our next growth idea is about focusing on downtown and NAU. So this came from feedback that, you know, when money or growth kind of opportunities or variables were low, there was a lot more investment in the downtown corridor first. So this is where that idea was born from. So the focus for development would be downtown and adjacent areas like the old hospital site to see more redevelopment. But there was a strong emphasis from the public during these workshops to, you know, not build anything taller than 6 stories. So in lieu with, or kind of in tandem with that, this growth idea is about focusing on the downtown and NAU area, but we want to, you know, minimize the loss of historic buildings while maximizing workforce and affordable housing in the area, in those areas. The fourth growth idea has more of a focus on East Flagstaff. And this came from feedback where there was a lot of placement from participants in the workshops on housing and a lot more narrative about affordable housing that needs to happen and amenities that need to happen in East Flagstaff. So this growth idea would look at what are the ways on the ground that we could place mixed use development along the 4th Street corridor and more employment along Route 66, including retail, government, et cetera, tech, so that we can improve the mix and variety of the uses and housing on the east side of Flagstaff. Our 5th growth idea, which we discussed in last tag, is perhaps maybe a kind of a universal, could be universally matched with many of these other growth ideas, but that it's about prioritizing conservation and natural areas that have high ecological values. So this strategy, or this growth idea, would look at how could growth happen with reducing the expansion into the wildland urban interface. And last but not least, our 6th growth idea came from just the idea of how can future growth and development be aimed to attract large employers into the area and bring more working class jobs into Flagstaff. So this would be something that would be about helping keep workers local and giving more living wage jobs that can, you know, match or be closer in matching to the housing options and availability that we can project. So those are the 6 growth ideas that we had discussed last meeting and just reviewed now. This slide here is showing how we've now coupled these growth ideas up just for the sake of us being able to chunk them out and have smaller group discussion. These aren't paired up necessarily because we're suggesting they go hand in hand, but perhaps throughout your discussion and the small breakout groups that will, you know, that might be a conclusion you arrive at. But yeah, we'll get into that. The emphasis for what these discussion breakout rooms will be is looking at these growth ideas and truly identifying on the ground what that might look like. What is the context and considerations we need to keep note of when we're trying to flesh out this growth idea into an actual scenario theme. And so we'll have note takers and facilitators help you with that. Another interesting aspect we want to fold into the discussion is, you know, how do the top 5 growth principles that the public identified, how do those resolve with any of these growth ideas? Are they complementary? Are they in conflict? We want to try to kind of pull these 2 important components together and see how they shake out. So we'll get into that, but thanks, Sachi, for queuing up this slide. I think we can go to the next one. So we can kind of see how the breakout room set up here. We're going to have about 40 or 50 minutes in rooms. And Sachi is working right now to randomly assign folks to one of these 3 rooms. You might not get the one that you want, but hopefully there'll be something there that you can chew on and react and reflect to. After we have some time reviewing each of the growth ideas that are in your particular room, we'll be coming back and sharing back kind of what the nature of the discussion was, and then seeing how we can kind of cross-pollinate, where are the cross-pollination opportunities with some of the themes that came up. All right, so the report back questions are kind of alluding to some of this a bit. Sachi, how are you doing on breakout room?
We're doing good. Just give me one more minute here.
Yeah, keep working that. Are there any questions? Anyone wants to unmute or put in the chat that they have so far?
I have a question.
Yes.
What I came away with last time was this idea that any and every possible growth idea that we would explore would have impact on the existing neighborhood or area. And so it seems like it might become an exercise in what's the most benefit with the least impact. And then it occurs to me today, or I wonder, like, is the idea that we're trying to narrow in and select 1 or 2 higher priority growth ideas, or is it possible that the end result is a mix of all of them?
Yeah, great question. So for the second question, the outcome we're looking for today is to just get our hands dirty with each of these growth ideas and flesh them out a bit more. You know, we have kind of the headline of what that growth idea might mean. But what we are looking for in small group discussion is to kind of sketch out what would urbanizing greenfield sites actually look like on the ground. We have prepared maps that have many context layers to them that show about, opportunity with existing infrastructure for vacant lots, or, what are those kind of conservation areas and roads and everything like that, that will all be layered in, and that you'll get acquainted with your facilitator to kind of give the context for where you might want to add more, add growth for jobs and housing, or at least flag considerations for that. And did I answer? Was the first question also addressed in that? Paul?
I can jump in here. I think there's a piece of this that where you're asking, we have these 6 growth ideas, are we trying to narrow them down to 2 or 3? That's not the job for today. But ultimately, to answer the second part of your question, we will be in all likelihood combining multiple growth ideas to create a scenario theme. And today is about figuring out a little bit more about what each of those growth ideas looks like on the ground, on the map. So we know which ideas seem to be more complementary. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. The first point was more an observation, and then you've answered the second question. Thanks.
Great.
All right, so we're ready to go into our breakout room groups. We will have till about 10 after the hour, so 11:10 we'll be coming back. So we'll have about a little over 40 minutes in our groups, and I'm gonna send people into those rooms now.
And don't forget.
All right, now I'm recording. Great. So before we get into that, any questions off the top?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, good. David Carpenter here. I do have a question.
Yeah.
When we did this 10 or 15 years ago, we kind of spent like 2 or 3 years having these same kind of conversations, charrettes at public places, thousands of people input. And then we had these scenarios. Do we want to grow in these nodes? Do we want to grow more suburban, or do we want to grow urban? It was a choice. And then the community voted on it. We voted on and chose urban. And then we spent the next 5 or 10 years seeing urban growth happen and public outcry, and then the policymakers coming in to stop all the urban growth. So now that there are actual like bans on multifamily inside Flagstaff, should we still be promoting in the logic of new urbanism, or because the laws now exist to prevent that, are we supposed to change our ethos and now decide that we give up on that and let's go build another city in Belmont and build another city in Winona? I'm kind of lost because I've lived here long enough to know that we've worked so hard to become urban, but then worked so hard against ourselves to become not urban.
Yeah, so there's sort of two things there. One is, should we be revisiting a decision that we seem to have made 10 years ago or so? And then there's a separate issue of, how is it that we have failed to follow through on that decision that we made? And I think to the first question, we have to be responsive to what we heard from the public. Whether or not we think that exploring this first growth idea, growing in rural activity centers is a good idea or not, we need to at least do our due diligence and create a scenario. And hopefully the scenario will show, with the modeling that we do, that maybe it's not such a great idea, or maybe there are trade-offs that people don't want to make by growing that way. So I think that's my answer to the, why would we do this if we decided 10 years ago that we didn't want to do it. And to the other question,
we can still work on scenarios, even if it's not something we're excited
yeah, the choice is going to come up, and I'll just be transparent that I think the many of the things that we are going to find through what comes out of a scenario that might be driven by this idea is not going to be that positive. It's going to likely show increases in VMT and, all the things that people probably didn't like when they voted against something like this 10 years ago. But because we are hearing from the public that they do want to see growth in these areas, we need to, do our job and explore that thoroughly, and then show if it's not a great idea and let them make the decision again. To the question of, what is it that, what does it all mean if at the end of the day, when we actually try to get these things built, that we're caving to public pushback? I think part of it is getting people on board from the very beginning through the comp plan. We're up at 10,000 feet. We're not talking about zoning necessarily, but if we can get people bought into the idea that this is maybe not a great way to grow, then when the proposal comes in to redevelop the old hospital site in a way that's more urban, people might support it more because they saw how this process rolled out and understand why doing that is an outgrowth of decisions we made in the comp plan. Gotcha. 7,200 feet. That's good. I like that. More accurate.
Tiny, I would add also from the local perspective that we are required by state statute to update the City of Flagstaff's general plan, which is the Flagstaff Regional Plan, and the Coconino County Comprehensive Plan every 10 years. And there's a reason why we're state mandated to update these every 10 years. Things change. And so certainly always taking in consideration what happened 10 years ago, but that was the update 10 years ago. And now we're doing a new update. Sure, we'll hear many of the same things that we heard then, that we've heard interim, as you've mentioned, but planning is a continual process, and I think it's a benefit that the state requires us to update these every 10 years to prompt us to do it, because things change, and priorities could very well change.
Absolutely.
It's really hard to see how this scenario can move forward based on the principles and the results from the survey.
I think
I
that's a
mean,
really
you look
good
at
point.
all of them, and it's like, well, if these are the principles, wildland urban interface,
Mhm.
water, transportation, protection of open space, this, I mean, you just look at the screen, that does not meet, this will not meet those principles. This will not rise to the top. If those are truly the principles and the demographic of the respondents to that survey, represents the greater Flagstaff area. Hard to see how this will move forward.
So maybe another way to think about that is there a way that we can speak to the things that we heard in the public engagement that was done, the Face the Future Flagstaff workshops, that also or that respects those principles? Is there a way that we can get more growth happening in some of these outlying areas in a way that doesn't completely put those on their head?
Maybe it changes what the activity center actually looks like.
Say more
Right.
about that.
I guess when I think of a rural activity center, I think of what currently exists now in Kachina, where you have the gas station, the future coffee shop, the Dollar General in that area, and that creates sort of an activity center. But if we're looking to have growth in these outer nodes, then those activity centers are going to be more perhaps more urban looking, or more services would be needed. And then that needs to fall into the jobs category, that principle of jobs and creating those jobs to support that's how I could see that we'd still meet those principles that we've heard from the community.
So this
Am I thinking about this in the right
Absolutely.
path? Okay.
Great observation, Julie. And I would point out in the case of this rural activity center we're actually looking at right now, we have continued to see continual transformation in this rural activity center, right? And just south of it is some in place existing multifamily zoning, which has been trying, for years. Probably the better part of 5 years to get a little bit more multifamily, off the ground. So I think in a way, this growth idea could be very much a considering all of the above, where there's available land under existing zoning entitlements, that if you can do more infill to provide more housing that helps with the workforce and affordable housing issue, great. Put it there. How do you get more of a mix of jobs? This location might be tougher, but Belmont is a great example of where there's interstate access, there's rail access, and there's vacant industrial and commercially zoned land. Probably a lack of water and sewer. However, that potentially more jobs could be going there, and we know there's continued housing growth there. So I think it could stay. This growth idea wouldn't necessarily be could be tempered to be within existing, say, area plan policies that do exist. And in the case of we have area plans for all of these rural activity centers, and most of them are relatively recent. None of them are our oldest area plans, so they're relatively updated, and we have a pretty good pulse on what the community feeling is in those areas. But I think this growth idea could add to some solutions potentially, without major departures from existing zoning or existing policies. If that makes sense.
No, I appreciate that, Jess. And it becomes pretty apparent to me, just the difference in zoning between city and county and the flexibility that's there, and why we've seen certain areas become be the more affordable areas, and certain growth patterns that we're starting to see out there. I know we're operating at a higher level, and David Carpenter, I share some of your concerns and agree with you to a certain extent about just what we have observed in the last 10 years and all of that work that we put into the regional plan, more like the last 20 years. All that work we put into the regional plan and got some big pushback when we saw infill and redevelopment in the urban areas and pushing that out. So thanks for hearing me out.
So I just threw in the Kachina Village plan here, and I do see the multifamily that that Jess is talking about here, just beyond where the activity center boundary is, and I can turn that back on. Second. But what's the case to be made here for? So here's our activity centers down here. What's the case to be made for this building out in this way? Would this be good for the region, do we think?
Alex, if I need to ask a question, and I apologize if it's already been answered elsewhere. I'm happy to read up on it elsewhere to hold up this conversation. But it would be helpful to me to understand, at least for the two growth ideas that we're taking a look at, any information around the reasoning that these were important. Why did our community feel that these were important? And I think they can give us a lot of information in terms of what we do with that, what needs to happen, that's responsive to them, and helps us to honor the principles at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this first growth idea about growing in these rural activity centers, that was one of the most common things that we heard from participants in the workshops, in the Face the Future workshops. They were actually putting growth in these outlying areas at a pretty high rate. And what we heard from them was that they were hoping for more opportunities to have, maybe you could call it a more complete community in these places, so that they didn't need to drive into Flagstaff for absolutely everything that they needed, but would be able to meet some of their needs just locally within their unincorporated community. So seeing them function a little bit more like small villages than bedroom communities of Flagstaff. Does that help?
Yes.
So back to my original question, if this built out, this would be a pretty sizable amount of population here, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of that. What I think is the spirit of what we heard from folks, that they wanted to see more, maybe more commercial uses in these places. This looks pretty much exclusively residential. So do we think that building out in this way would satisfy what we heard from members of the community?
I feel like you'd need like some kind of a grocery store center and some little multifamily node that would make that like its own place. Right now, everyone in Kachina comes to Flagstaff for everything.
Mm-hmm. And what's the what has? Go ahead.
My gut tells me as well. I mean, the grocery store, right? It's not a matter of us just asking for there to be one. The grocery store needs to want to be there as well, and that's going to be driven almost entirely by the number of heartbeats there are within a 1 mile radius. So does the current density and the current population support that need, or do we need to see basically an increase in the number of people there to justify a grocery store moving in, and be able to expect that a grocery store would move in? But I do agree with David. It feels like the grocery store is kind of the key anchor for any of that stuff.
So if we're thinking back to some of those growth principles that were elevated through the survey, public transit, meeting our climate goals, those sorts of things, you could make a case, I think, that if this built out in this way, having some amount of retail to capture some of the trips that might otherwise just go up to Flagstaff could be moving in that right direction. What do y'all think about that idea?
mean, Kachina is a little bit of a mixed bag, right? It's not like a suburb 20 miles away where I would consider it terribly wasteful to be driving on the highway. This is, I mean, it's literally just outside the urban growth boundary. It's extremely close.
Yeah, there's the city boundary is the blue, so it's kind of just right down the road. And I think this yellow here, by the way, is the proposed new Northern Arizona Health Campus. So you've got potentially quite a bit of development going in there that maybe could shorten some of those trips into Flagstaff, if depending on what ends up there.
I mean, I'm clicking back and forth between the county map, and like the reality is to have a conversation about Kachina. It's only on the other side of the highway that there's actually developable land. On the east side of 17, there's a guy with 50 acres. There's a couple tens. I mean, there isn't much within that Kachina Village plan that isn't already developed or has a plat on it.
Is that including the multifamily area to the north here?
I mean, that's Kachina Village North, it's called. It's been planted
So it
for
looks
like
like
10 years.
Yeah, it looks like it's fairly built out. So this is an instance. I mean, maybe Jess knows this, but has this been built?
Oh yeah, it's built out. It continues to redevelop. It continues to have infill. The area plan really illustrates the history of Kachina Village, of once upon a time being primarily marketed and planned for second homes, mountain summer homes, to having turned into at one point more of workforce housing, slightly more affordable housing for people who lived in Flagstaff, to now continuing to redevelop again into second homes of many of the homes. But there's manufactured housing on that north end quite a bit, and that really does fill some of the workforce housing and affordable housing needs of the community. Always has. So it is pretty well. Kachina Village is pretty well built out. The last pieces of Kachina Village that could be rezoned and replatted were within the past 2-3 years. Probably at the activity center that we were looking at near the interchange is where there is a little bit of vacant multifamily zone land. And of course, the commercially zoned land at the activity center would have multifamily permitted by right under the county zoning ordinance, being that it's in an activity center. So redevelopment is potential more at the activity center to densify, but the majority of what you see platted in that kind of more suburban style pattern is developed.
Okay, so there's actually not that much capacity for change here.
No, there's really not.
Okay, well that's good.
It's minimal. Yeah.
Someone mentioned Belmont, and it's interesting because their plan has capacity for thousands of jobs. What do we think about this as helping to support some of those goals, some of those growth principles that were elevated as part of the survey? Can this fit into that somehow?
In this case, I would tell you that it being a more recent area plan, the community in general supported the concept of more population, more housing units brings you more services. And there were discussions about, hey, could we ever have enough population to have our own school? Would we ever have enough population to have our own grocery store? So in this case, the community, the residential community, which all lies on the north side of I-40 here, they were supportive of the idea of increased density, increased mixed use in order to get the neighborhood serving amenities that they would like. And then, of course, there is a lot of vacant industrial and commercial land in this area that could potentially have jobs. The limitations are it's a private water and sewer company on the north side of I-40 that has been supporting the residential development north of I-40. South of I-40 really lacks a water and sewer system. So it has only attracted heavy commercial and industrial uses that are not heavy water or wastewater needs. But it does have good interstate and rail access.
I would say one of the biggest challenges of Belmont is there's only one traffic interchange, and that has created a huge
Yep.
problem for that community, and they're locked. They're
Absolutely.
locked by private land to the west to be able to make a secondary connection. And then we've seen build out and plats that kind of restrict the opportunity for another traffic interchange. And that's a huge dollar amount. You know, we're
Yeah.
talking $80 million for a traffic interchange that there's no appetite at the state level, or there wasn't a couple of years ago, to pay for that. So growth is, I mean, it's pretty hamstrung there because of that single point of access. So as much as, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna restate. So functionally, the amount of growth that's in the plan is capped by lack of getting another interchange in there.
Mhm.
Yeah. And the utilities that Jess was talking about. I don't know if the existing water system can serve all of those folks and still meet their 100-year requirements.
Mhm. Are there any other rural activity centers like Fort Valley or Donny Park where there is a viable capacity for growth, like infrastructure? Well, the land, maybe more importantly, roadway connections, zoning.
I think
Fort Valley
Cosmino,
probably
people
has
talking
the most limited with zoned land that would have entitlements, and an area plan that does not encourage commercial uses, anything beyond neighborhood serving.
You said Fort Valley.
Yeah, and again, at Fort Valley, the water scenario is probably even more limited than Belmont.
So Fort Valley has
could probably support where there is vacant lots as zoned can continue to develop. So there will be a slow, trickle of continued housing, more housing developed in Fort Valley, which are all large lot rural because of the lack of water and sewer. The commercial areas along Fort Valley, more than where there is a little bit of commercial zoning, will more than likely be outdoor tourist oriented, continued development based on Snowball Road, Snowball access, and the route, the main route from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon. So there's very limited vacant commercial zoning within the Fort Valley area.
David C., were you going to say something?
I was saying it's kind of different, but out at Cosmino, we've noticed that the Navajo Nation's purchased some very large tracts over the years, and I don't know if we always planned with them, but that could be a cool area to plan something with them. I don't know why they bought those 200 or 300 acres, but clearly they could build whatever they want if they make that reservation land. But there's no services of any kind there, just lots of vacant land and a highway interchange, which is obviously hugely valuable.
Where is that?
Cosnino Road, east side.
It's within the far east portion of the
So it's out
Donny
here.
Park. Yep, right there.
Yeah, so that interchange is all like vacant land owned by the Navajo Nation. And some small houses here and there around the periphery.
Mm-hmm. And Donny Park, is Donny Park mostly, I mean, there are multiple activity centers. What was the thinking there the last time around? Does anyone have any institutional memory of that?
That's where the existing commercial zoning and activity, it's where the existing commercial zoning is at main intersections. There's very, very little vacant commercial land left at each of those rural activity centers. So those rural activity centers could continue to expand minimally, and they could redevelop. However, that is all very limited based on, there is a water system, the Donny Park water system, which is like a nonprofit water district essentially, but there's no wastewater there's no wastewater system here, so you have to have on-site wastewater, which severely limits the density that you can do with any development.
Okay.
And I think that's the most recent area plan that was completed. Melissa finished that out not too long ago, and that was not for the faint of heart. That was a very difficult area planning process to get through. I sat in on quite a number of those meetings, and there is, in general, a very strong desire to keep it rural and to limit the growth that happens in that particular area.
Mhm. What about public transit? We heard that people wanted to see better connections, and in the purple, you can see what the existing routes are, and you're probably all well aware of where these go, but Donny Park, Belmont don't have these connections, but Kachina Village and Fort Valley do. Do we think that it would be viable to extend something out to these other unincorporated communities?
I think Mountain Line has looked at that. They've done some modeling. They looked at a special service out in the Belmont area. I know there is a desire from a handful of those communities. It doesn't necessarily pencil, but I think that would be a good question for Busy Collins at Mountain Line.
Mm-hmm.
They have evaluated a number of times, and they're actually going through a process right now of their planning, and they have a citizen advisory committee that they've put together, and it's about frequency and service, and kind of evaluating what are the trade-offs between extending service versus increasing frequency. And I think it seems to be narrowing in on frequency along existing routes.
Mm-hmm.
is what is feasible at this point, given the number of rooftops out there. And for transit to be viable, it has to be very convenient. So it has to be usually less than a half-hour intervals between that. And to serve Belmont, Kachina Village, Mountain Air, Donny Park area, the population does not exist there yet.
Right. I want to talk just briefly before we switch to the other growth idea about as a way to accommodate some of the region's housing demand, and maybe we can touch a little bit on which of these focus areas could best support the housing needs of some of the native nations in the region. Not being too familiar with where housing is located for some of the reservations in the area, I'd be curious if anyone in this group would have an idea of which of these, like which side of the region more housing options would be most beneficial for those populations.
I mean, I would say, just from my little knowledge, east would be better because it's close to home, right? So there are many folks who will work in Flagstaff during the week and go back to the res, which they consider home, for the weekend. And so if they kind of have their, should you say, weekday residents, having it, over on that side of the town is definitely much more convenient.
Mm-hmm. So that would be kind of the Donny Park, or maybe, David C. brought this up here, Cosnino Road. This area could be an interesting solution to that issue. Creating a bridge for those folks. Any other thoughts about that?
That makes sense to me. Could I also ask a little bit more in terms of, I heard the remark earlier that the residents that live in these areas currently, for example, I think I heard Donny Park, they had a desire to keep that area rural. I think that's the kind of information that's really important to keep into consideration, no matter what area we are exploring. So being able to have a easy understanding of where the local residents stand on these areas, on these plans, these ideas, growth ideas, would be really important as well. So in terms of who wanted this, I think would be really, necessary to consider and how we proceed and what is viable, what is not. So I would include, having good sense, just generally speaking, in terms of utilities, where do we stand on these areas? in terms of the desire of the local residents, where do they stand, and things like that. If that's already somewhere else, I'm happy to read up on it, but that's too helpful for me.
Yeah, that's hopefully something we'll be able to revisit once we produce these different scenario ideas. So we'll be able to explain these are the pieces of the scenario that are factoring into where growth's happening, like that or not. So those questions will be posed to the public the next round of public engagement. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I'm curious
yeah.
to hear Ben's thoughts. I know I just haven't heard from Ben.
Yeah, I'm listening.
I know you are.
I did drop the first 10 minutes or so of this breakout because I had a connection problem. I don't really have any strong thoughts on this. I do agree with everything that I heard said. Is there something specific that I can help you with?
I was just more wondering if you did agree with those thoughts, or if you had other.
I do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I do. One thought, and this is just a point of emphasis, not of disagreement, but the cost of infrastructure was brought up several times. And this is a huge issue. I think that, I've kept emphasizing this in every meeting, but the main thing that I think we need to be concerned about going forward is lack of money, public money for public infrastructure. I think we are probably at this moment, we probably have the most money we're ever going to have, and it'll probably be a lot less in the future. So bonding capacity, ability to pay for infrastructure, who's going to pay for the infrastructure, that's really front and center, and it can't be assumed that we will be able to pay for it at all, especially if it's not a super high priority. And I think I heard that reflected in the conversations about Belmont as an example.
Yeah.
So I agree with that.
Thanks. That's helpful. And it's definitely appearing that there may be some of these communities may have an appetite for growth, but even if they do, that there's functional constraints on that. And some other communities like Donny Park just don't. So that's good to know. We need to pivot. I'm sorry, we need to pivot.
Yeah, can I one last comment, follow up on what Ben said? I think there's a there's a potential option, right, for we focused in on infrastructure being the limiting factor. If there's potential for partnerships either right over at Cosnino with the Navajo Nation in terms of being able to bring financial capacity, or at least debt capacity, right, for providing infrastructure, or if there is over at Belmont through some kind of reutilization of the former military base over there. That's one other consideration. There is also the thought that the Red Gap Ranch pipeline project will likely be going right through the Cosnino area, and so there's water, available there, if that could be, tapped into.
I don't think Red Gap Ranch will make water available, although it's conceivable that it could, but that would require a completely separate and duplicative water treatment plant and wastewater treatment plant for that area, unless the city went with a totally novel approach, like requiring all the buildings to have their own on-site treatment, which actually is doable in the modern world. It wasn't 50 years ago, but now it is.
All right, we need to spend just a couple minutes here talking about the fifth growth idea, prioritize conservation and avoid hazards. It's kind of a big one and we don't have enough time to talk about it, unfortunately. That's my fault. But I think one of the things we heard from the priorities from the survey was avoid developing in the wildland urban interface. That's kind of the whole region though, right? Like there's fire risk pretty much everywhere. So what do we do? What is a practical way to try to focus growth away from the most at-risk areas? Does anyone have any ideas about that?
Can you ask the question again, please?
There's background noise. So this is from the Water Commission's point of view, or the water point of view. We observe that the costs of hazards in the area, if you look at all the different hazards that have happened, somewhere around 100% of those costs, not of fighting fires or emergency management, but of actual impacts from hazards have been flooding. Right. So, and I'm not saying it's 100%, right? I'm just saying flooding, including both flooding because people built in the wrong places to begin with, and also flooding because of post-fire flows. That's basically the dominant hazard around here. And so we might want to focus on other things later, but the first thing we should talk about is how do you make sure development stays far clear of potential flooding. And that in turn is actually a really easy, that's actually a really easy way to define the problem, because floods happen in low-lying areas, right? So it's not like it's a mystery where the flood's going to happen. So that's, anyway, there you go.
Yeah, so we have our 500-year flood zones. We have our delineated floodways. There's also alluvial fans, which, as we, I'm not an expert, but as we understand it, these are areas where if there is fire above and then that leads to flooding, those soils are much more likely to move because they are a historic, prehistoric water course. And we have some data on where that is. It looks like it's largely kind of northeast Flagstaff and into the Doney Park area. But does anyone know more about this than we do? Could you lend any more substance to that?
I know a lot about it. If you want me to talk about it, short version is, though, we need to make sure the hydrologists are consulted, and it is not sufficient to rely on the federal or state government's regulations, because all they're going to tell you is to stay out of the extremely low-lying areas that are flooded frequently without fires. That's the FEMA 100-year floodplain, right?
Right.
What we need to be looking at is the post-fire floodplains for the community. In all cases, you have to assume that the forest is all going to burn, and you have to assume that when it does, there's going to be a post-fire flow. And so the flood planning map and the hazard map we need to be using, it has to be based on post-fire assumptions, not FEMA assumptions. And unfortunately, the post-fire assumptions are extremely onerous. They place severe restrictions on where you can build.
So Ben, I think we're going to put a pin in that and maybe reach out to you afterwards, knowing that you have that knowledge and maybe can connect us to some other folks. So thank you for that. Are there any other critical environmental hazards or conservation areas that we think need to be considered that aren't already protected?
Yeah, I mean, it just strikes me that yeah, I mean, most of it's national forest, so who cares, you know, it's not, it's irrelevant, right? We're not touching it anyway. And they, you know, but the larger point I think for me is that this scenario doesn't feel like an individual one in and of itself, right? It feels somewhat like a principle that could be laid on top of any other of the scenarios. You could imagine it right, like sitting on top of all the other ones, right? Whether that's rural activity centers, downtown growth, East Flagstaff growth, and infill, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know that that there really is anything that says to me like, okay, that means don't build here and build here instead.
I mean, there's this idea of hard constraints and soft constraints. We can put a hard constraint on a scenario saying, in this boundary, we will not place growth, or we can make it a soft constraint and kind of measure how each scenario performs. So if a scenario that focuses on downtown growth tends to consume much less of land in an area that is low-lying or in an alluvial fan or in the 500-year floodplain, that could be something that is beneficial and that we can make a case for and that the public might support. And I think what we're seeing with the information we have so far is that the growth idea we talked about first, about growing in these outlying areas, one of the things that it doesn't have going for it is that these areas tend to be some of the places that are most at risk. So I think if we can think about, and we can do this in the group discussion too, think about metrics, things we can measure to make a case that one scenario or another does better on this topic. I think that would be the most helpful thing.
One of the other things to consider, a couple of our group members are aware of this, but for the ones that aren't, in the unincorporated county and where you see the flood hazard that you're showing your Steiny up in the Doney Park area, in the unincorporated county, when you have vacant private land, it can be split, what we call lot split or wildcat subdivisions, without any engineering done. As long as you're leaving it in the same large lot zoning that it's currently in. So that's one of the reasons why we have worse flooding problems in these rural lot split areas, because there was no storm or very little to no stormwater engineering that went into those areas, because there was no subdivision engineering. They were just split. Parcels were just split down over time with private easements acting as the roads to access those parcels. So that is one of the reasons why in the larger lot rural areas, the flooding issues can be even worse, because stormwater management was not a part of a subdivision plan in those areas, if that helps.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts about things we can measure with respect to environmental constraints? Is there anything about view sheds or growth on hillsides that has come up?
I could add something that's a little more abstract.
Sure.
So when you had the screen up that showed all the brown forest land that we all cherish so much that we want to protect, we could, you know, it doesn't have to be something that goes up.
Hi.
All right, there we go.
Got it.
Back on. Great. Thanks, Jenny. Okay, let's get back on track here. So, all right, so no major motion sickness for this group. I'll try to limit any of those crazy turns here. But anyway, so we're looking at an aerial of Flagstaff. And so some context layers that might be helpful for this discussion, we'd imagine, would be the transportation lines here. So you can kind of see those. There's, I can, for what it's worth, I'm going to move through this a little quickly, but I think it's important. So we have existing lines that are in this kind of blue shade, which I admittedly are a little difficult to see. So these are trails, but not including access to trails. We have planned, trails here too, which might not be showing up as well. Existing bike lanes, that's coming in a green, kind of very faint green line. Missing bike lanes, which is a dark purple. We have sidewalks, kind of these red, pinkish lines, and then we have public transit, which those lines I'm not. There we are, the deep red lines. So I think that we don't need to necessarily memorize them, but just know that a lot of these transportation lines are showing up in the spectrum of colors. I'll also highlight the sewer lines, which is more of the purple, more lines. It's going to be lines and polygons here today. And so that's a much more broad, I think that one is a more notable layer that we can see here. Maybe before I jump down, I'm also going to add in the city boundary. So that is this blue perimeter, probably familiar. And we also have the metropolitan boundary, yellow line around here. And now I'm going to scoot back up. Okay. Other context layers that we can add in here are all of these future developments or existing developments, which would include the JWP alignment. I think that I just saw that pop up right here, where you would expect it to. I'm going to zoom out before I add in this layer of vacant parcels. Excuse me. So this is, you're going to see a bunch of polygons pop up here in a second. And this is vacant parcels. Well, I thought it would be more profound than that. So there's red, orange, yellow, and green lots here that are identified. And this is on a score based on their ability or their connectivity with utilities at this point in time. So sewer, water, I think broadband might actually also be included in that. But, kind of intuitively, green are vacant lots that have better or, the best connectivity versus red are not. But nonetheless, these are all identified as vacant lots. Let me see if there's any other information. As of data that has been collected from November 2021. Okay.
This is Michelle, is there a size limit on those? Like how small do they get? Is it parcels as in divided by the city?
Yeah, I'm not sure the smallest parcel size at this point, but I think we have down to like, I'm really not sure actually, so I can't answer. All right, so we can pin that question. All right, we got the Flagstaff Mall. I think that's over here. There it is. And then NH campus. Oh, the boundary, right. I think that's where oh, there it is. Yep. It's like keep getting myself turned around here. Let's get the north. Let's get north again. There we go. All right. This is a little bit of the setup before we dive in. Okay. I'll also highlight city parks and open space. So these are parcels owned by the city and their current and intended uses including open space and parks. So that's what's in these green polygons. Highlighting rural growth boundaries and the urban growth boundary, which is pretty intuitive here based on all of the other layers here. Are we so far so good? Is this all kind of checking out? I'm feeling like the layering will be important rather than having them all in one place, but this is kind of where, once we get this together, then we can kind of look at some key questions about where would we see growth happening in these greenfield sites. All
So I do have a question as far as the layering goes.
Mhm.
So this kind of light green urban growth boundaries, is this the area that we would be focusing on? This light green that you're showing?
Yeah, so this would be the area that we could consider as far as greenfield sites that are undeveloped at this point. It's kind of, what's difficult is that some of these layers kind of cancel each other out. So we'll have to toggle them in and out. It's a limitation of this and just kind of the sequencing of layers.
Okay. I guess my other question too is, are we looking at this light blue layer as well, which is the rural, I think? Are we considering kind of both of those?
Yes. Yeah. And thanks for clarifying, Stephanie. So when I zoom out a bit, we can see kind of the whole spectrum of it here.
And Ayano, I was actually thinking we could get I don't know if you turn on the federal lands under parks and open space, that will might help us not need those other layers because it's possible it's everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually something we talked about in preparing for this. So this we can kind of use, this might be an easier simplified version. I think that's a good idea, Jenny. All right.
Yeah, so I think that's easier to see. So basically everything that's in that that doesn't, that's just kind of not colored would be okay.
And then possibly if you turn on just below that parks and open space, because that will take care of the really most critically observatory mesa there.
Good. It's nice to have folks that are familiar with this, so this isn't thrown too hard on. Just a little bit, right?
So if there's areas, like I'm looking kind of by the new hospital site, and then there's that big orange vacant property that's colored orange, but then right above it is not highlighted, but it looks to be that there's nothing on there. So that would we would assume that someone owns that, and that's not really for consideration of this discussion.
Yeah, I think
is that how I'm interpreting this map?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll admit that I don't have all of the layers memorized, like the back of my hand. But I think that for the purposes of what we put as context layers there, that's how we're kind of understanding this.
Okay, I guess I'd be interested to know, because that looks like that's, in the middle of two housing developments. Is that owned by a developer that's planning on putting housing there already, or?
Do you have a layer of state land?
We don't. We just have the metro. I think the highest level. Yeah, let me just check. Jurisdictional neighborhood.
I can check on that parcel. I believe the orange is state land, but I'm not possible. I can check. One of the two is state land, either the orange or just above it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think just one other layer that could be interesting is that I'll zoom out a bit for is the suburban activity centers. So these are areas that have been identified in the 2030 regional plan and other planning documents for future development or as hubs. I think, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it's really interesting for, this greenfield site development to talk about that area of the new hospital. Because I think there's going to be some natural development over there happening as a result. And so this layer that you just turned on, I mean, was that assuming this hospital being placed there?
This layer was not, I guess it's like a distinctive data point, and that it was already part of from a planning process before that identified these suburban activity areas. So it's not something that was in conjunction, or I don't know that it's related. Yeah, it's from the 2030 plan.
Right, but the one with the hospital was recently changed the end of last year to a regional activity center and moved a little bit south. So I don't know if that's that's still down in your layer as suburban. It's not the new one, which is just a little bit south and is a regional activity center.
Yeah, we don't have the regional activity centers on.
Well, that makes sense for Greenfield because none of them were out in the Greenfields until very recently. So
yeah, well, I guess that these are all the layers we have for any of the growth idea maps. But
I just wanted to let you guys know it's a regional, so yeah, it has a little different meaning in terms of activity centers compared to suburban.
Yeah. Well, so I think those are the most, oh, here we go. Oh gosh, this one. Okay, let me just get this.
Just one quick update. That parcel in question above the orange, that is state trust land. That is, I am probably talking out of turn, but I believe everyone is talking about that. That's going to go up for development.
Okay. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for getting the details on that. Okay. Well, I think based on just kind of what you were starting to say, Stephanie, how do folks feel about kind of talking about development around the new hospital site? This also kind of dovetails with the other growth idea that is part of this group's discussion is, attracting large employers. Yes, we have the new hospital site already slated in the works, but yeah, just want to kind of remind us of that. Based on what you already know and what has already been slated, where do you feel like there, maybe around this area, are places most feasible and ready for change, and what kind of change do you see happening?
Well, it seems like we should count the hospital as a large employer, right? So
is that, and I don't know enough about that, but is that going to increase the employment or just shift the employment?
It's really just a shifting at this point, is my understanding, but they have the option of, NAH has the option of expanding their actual, put in another patient tower. So therefore there would be more employees.
Okay.
Yeah. But for immediately it's not expected to go up much. And then if their wellness village proposal comes into play, that would have more employees in terms of like hotels or restaurants. If that happens, that still hasn't gotten through council. So
yeah.
Sorry, I stopped short. There's this one other layer that might be a little more distracting than helpful at this point, kind of similar to what we discussed earlier, is, this is also just the land ownership of the public and private land ownership we have here. So I think just like Jenny pointed out, maybe we have this coded for as already federal land that's been designated or already slated for plans. Purple here, okay. Does this layer feel helpful for continuing the discussion? I think
Can you
it's.
explain what the colors mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm confused on what the colors mean versus the colors of the orange and green,
Right.
yellow.
Yeah. So the orange, so the, yeah, like this kind of peach color
Yeah.
is state trust land. We have, I guess, national and other state land
Forest. Yeah.
in
Okay.
purple. Yeah. And then I
So
think,
that, would it be fair to say that kind of the purple and peach would be undeveloped?
No, so what's
Okay.
interesting, and Ayanna, if you don't mind if I weigh in.
please, yeah.
State land is the state trust land, and that is often held for future development. And it's essentially, and Jordan or anyone feel free, but it's essentially is held by the state as part of, I think, school funding, and it can be moved into development. So there's a lot of talk about just above those orange parcels above the hospital that state trust land will go online soon. And so I think it's fair to y'all's purpose to talk about that as potential for infill, essentially. But Jordan, feel free to.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that thanks for jumping in there. And then there's another one over by Continental Country Club where you see the activity center on the more east side of town. That's also has been identified as one that will be sold. So a little bit to the, yeah, right there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So pure greenfield.
Yep.
So do those get sold then primarily, I mean, as that lot gets sold to a developer, so it would all be zoned likely for one thing? I mean, are they under city's planning and zoning right now? Probably not if they're under state land.
They do have a zoning designation that would likely change if someone would buy it. So I think most of those lands are zoned like estate residential, which is our lowest density residential zone. But that would not. So in our current regional plan, they would be supportive of rezoning those to anywhere from single family to medium density residential, probably even up maybe high within the activity center on the parcel that we're looking at there. But the developer would go through that process with us.
Would they all stay residential though?
No, it could be some commercial too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, Jordan, is it fair to say that can be this conversation essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the conversation of the regional plan of is that an area that you all would want to see as higher density?
Yeah, so for example, the parcel there that we're looking at where the cursor is identified as future suburban. And that in the current regional plan would we've identified that as anywhere, but in terms of residential density, I think it's like 6 to I want to say it's like 15 units per acre. It might be a little higher than that, as well as a mix of commercial uses. So yeah, I think Jenny's right. I think it's fair that that's part of the conversation. What should that look like? Is certainly a good discussion point to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what would that look like? What would make, given, let's pivot over here or stay here then. Given the context of this area, what do you what makes the most sense and feels most possible for change here?
Can I ask, I'd like to ask a question. How does that relate to where Walnut Canyon is? I'm trying to remember when I went to the workshop. It seemed like we had surrounded some area around Walnut Canyon as, conservation and not building next to. So I'm just curious. Does anyone know?
You're gonna have to remind me where Walnut Canyon is.
You'll have to, if you take off the purple, it might help. Because you see that outline to the kind of southeast of that parcel, that's where Walnut Canyon is.
That's what I was wondering. It looks suspiciously like, okay.
Yeah, so it's a couple parcels over essentially, right?
Okay.
It's far on the other side of that brown right now.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so the new hospital. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say that area that we were just looking at, I'd find it hard to see that people would really support heavy commercial development over there. Being so embedded in a residential area already and kind of singular traffic flow. If I'm looking at the area right, I think that's probably off of Country Club, maybe. You know, that's just my 2 cents, but.
That's the kind of sense we want right now.
I think if we were gonna look at like kind of to couple it with the bringing in jobs, that would not be the area I would target. I would put more off of where the hospital is right off the interstate, both interstates. Makes it easier for commuters, travel, people visiting, that kind of things that I think businesses look at when looking to expand and move into the area. That area is a lot more appealing.
And it's my understanding from talking to Sarah is that those activity centers, you know, probably would be modified depending on scenario selected, you know, so they're not set in stone, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, great point. I think that this is part of the kind of experimental, the testing part of it is using these concepts that, you know, are all good ideas, but how to, when we're really trying to resolve a number of objectives here, what actually makes most sense, and we have new information.
And just when you zoomed in, you know, it showed the airport right there too, and that's a good reminder that this area seems like a premier site for commercial development more than residential. I think there probably needs to be some component of residential development, given I think hospitals require a certain like response time for their staff, right? And I don't know if there's enough housing over there to meet that. But that this general area seems like a good development area of a greenfield site. Even though, you know, personally, I'd like to see more development in the existing sites that have vacant tenants. But I know that's not this group.
You'll be able to chime in later too.
I'm just curious, has there been much interest from like our entertainment, any of the folks that own the amphitheater when it comes to this? I just kind of think what happened to the Sedona Cultural Center. I don't know if you're all familiar with the beautiful amphitheater down there. It was closed because noise ordinance complaints, and it could rival Red Rocks in its majestic beauty. Can't see that many, but have they been part of this at all?
I know that the county is really concerned about that, and they've been working with the NIH folks to address that concern.
Okay.
And so that wouldn't affect the Pepsi Amphitheater.
Okay.
I don't know what the resolution is. I think they're still meeting with NIH about that, but that was one of their primary concerns that they expressed to me personally, and also at a city council meeting. So.
Okay.
So the noise is like the biggest concern. The hospital said that they were putting on some kind of they called it a skin on the hospital to help the noise on that side.
Yeah.
I don't know any more than that. So.
Okay, no, I was really interested in we can only probably just should talk about what's actually on the table, and that's hospital. Of course, that does run 24/7, but it would be a different conversation if they're going to put in tons of, you know, housing units, parks, all those types of things, and where Arizona fits, or this amphitheater sits. It's mostly weekdays because premier acts are going to go weekends. So it's not like Scott can side skirt it by saying it's just going to be Friday nights. Anyway.
So just for context, the idea is that it is parks, hotels, shopping, as well as homes.
Okay.
On the hospital site, and that plan has essentially been approved. But as Michelle said, they're talking about that. But I just want to kind of follow up on Stephanie's comments too. You know, there are folks, there's the conversation is essentially that it's mixed use, right? Is that it
Okay.
is kind of all the above of, you know,
Mhm.
hotels as well as homes, et cetera, et cetera. Just from a climate perspective, like that's good, right? We want people to be able to commute. We don't want just employers or just housing, right? We want both together, if that makes sense. So just for some more context.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Just a quick time check. So we have about 10 minutes before we need to go back. That I think we still have good time. I want to make sure that as we're looking across the region, there aren't any other, we identified kind of this Cottage Grove or area, and then around the new hospital site and airport. Are there other kind of greenfield site or general areas that we would want to zoom into and discuss?
So again, a little confused on the colorations on here, but if you go just south of the 40, you have this like kind of brighter green, a peach, yellows. Those are all vacant areas. Am I reading this correctly here?
This is land. This is private and public land that's owned. So the peach would be is a straight trust.
Okay, but that big green swath right there, yeah, is that
vacant? This is a privately owned
okay?
Vacant residential. What's what we got here?
Is this the JW Powell area? Can you point where that is?
Yeah,
I think it is.
It seems like
that's
like a
Juniper
continuation.
okay.
That's
'Cause I
Juniper
remember
Point, which is a
piece of
development
land
that's been
shape.
planned.
Here,
There he is. Good.
So is Juniper Point a
planned single family residential development?
Okay.
But that's it. To me, the JW Powell area is the other place of greenfield. I know that I'm pretty sure that the developers there, people who own that, are looking at houses. I don't know if employment is also considered there. You know, the area around the hospital, there's discussion about like some industrial kind of work there, perhaps. I don't know. I don't think that's been approved yet, but there's discussion. And so I wonder if that part of JW Powell that's closest to the hospital, that's not in a development, like a housing development, might be a place for jobs.
You're talking about this area, Michelle?
Yeah, where's the airport?
The airport.
Yeah, right. I think it's there. So it'd be past the like this development with all the green pieces.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, there's so much uncertainty about, you know, who owns what and what they want to do there, right? So I'm actually thinking of the area like, yeah, is this the purple that's right there where your cursor is? That's federal land? Yeah. Yeah, so it wouldn't be there. It'd probably be further past this this parcel. What is this one with all the golf courses, right?
It's Pine Canyon.
There, but you know, I don't know. I guess I don't know about development in that area, and maybe Jordan knows, but it seems like the discussion so far, as I've heard, is about houses, but I don't know if the developers are thinking of something else beyond that. So,
well, and I'm curious, you know, does the school district have land sprinkled in here to add schools where if all these housing areas are going up, how does
Jordan, they're planning for a school, right?
School and a fire station is what I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the school front whether they have any land outside of like as far as the Board of Regents, whether they would have anything.
Well, I do know about the Board of Regents, and we're not affiliated with FUSD.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we do talk, you know, land swaps and different things like that, but most of our land is concentrated we're the area that's not colored right there.
Right.
Yeah, that's our land right there.
Yeah, I do believe they've talked about like if the growth of this area is so high. And I think the question is, and Ayana, feel free to redirect me, but I think the question is not what the developers have planned, but do you all see this as a place where you would want to see more? Like, what do you all think? Maybe not the developers.
I think it's a weird spot to have a lot of commercial. I mean, I think the connection with JW Powell is an interesting, is going to be interesting. You know, I don't know traffic wise, and I know the city has the Lone Tree work happening too. So I think that could help with some more commercial development along those corridors. But otherwise, when you get into that heavily colored area south of the 40, the traffic flow would become really difficult, I feel like, for heavy commercial, without some major infrastructure changes.
Right.
And so again, I think kind of that area by the hospital is a lot more attractive for that. And then other areas outside of town, I don't know if we really looked at like the Belmont area. I don't know how that's kind of looking, but I also don't know who all these new jobs are, where these new jobs are coming from.
Yeah, well, I think that's a question too. Is there, like, based on what you know, I mean, what types of employers do you see Flagstaff being able to attract or are aiming to appeal to?
I know what kind of services I feel like are missing here, but I don't know what kind of employers we're actually able to attract. I mean, I think, you know, I think this healthcare thing is going to be interesting because I think we have a big lack of healthcare up here. And, you know, like, as you know, a person with 2 young children, I have to go to Phoenix to see specialists for things because I can't see them up here, especially, you know, there's a big lack of pediatric services up here out beyond your general care. I think there's a, you know, at NAU, we have a really big summer camps and conference experience. Up here, we're doing a really big camp right now. And I think that could perhaps be an under-tapped market for tourism for the rest of the city. And again, here at NAU, we do a lot of like accommodations for high altitude training for elite athletes. And I wonder, when it comes to the healthcare market, especially, like, is that a missed opportunity for, or an opportunity to expand into that, and, you know, get more business generated that way.
Or specialized sports medicine as a branch of healthcare.
Yeah.
Okay. It's really interesting.
And Trader Joe's.
And that too. Yeah. Because the health practitioners need to get quick snacks and food. Okay, we have only a couple minutes before we go back into the larger group. That doesn't mean that we can't continue to, like, add to these comments, but I do want to just make sure there aren't any other, like, big picture hot takes that we want to include in our summary. And I'm hoping, Jordan, you'd be okay with leading the summary and report back of this when we get to the bigger group. Does that sound okay? Maybe.
Yeah, I guess, can we clarify a few things?
Yeah.
Just in terms of what I've been taking notes of. So it sounded like there was a lot of interest in, especially which I guess makes sense, the state trust pieces of land that we already know are kind of slated for development. So that's over by kind of the country club area, a little bit to the north of the hospital site, and then along the new JWP alignment were kind of the 3 main sites. Were there any others as far as larger greenfield areas that were identified?
I'm looking at that one that's right on I-40. It's kind of above the country club area we looked at, and it crosses I-40 and Route 66. That's state land. Am I right? Am I interpreting that correctly? Yeah. So that seems like a really good place for employment because it's got some really great access.
And it's already pretty commercial over there.
Right. So that one really jumps out at me. You know, there's 2 sides of the highway there. Those to me would be really high priority.
Yeah, I agree with that one too.
Good access and yeah.
people that are out like Winslow area, Tuba City area, just draw, you know, more people that way too.
Great. And then I guess we didn't, I mean, I know, Stephanie, you mentioned some hesitancy around commercial, the idea of commercial being added to the state trust parcel to the south of, yeah, that one right there. But we didn't get into a conversation of what some of those should look like. So I guess we have like 3 minutes. Was there any thoughts beyond that people wanted to share? Like what you think might be appropriate for those sites?
I just keep thinking about the that recent business that moved in, maybe to the Walgreens warehouse or somewhere over there where they were doing fabrication of parts for EV vehicles. And you know, I'm not saying this area would be great for that, but maybe the one up closer to, you know, away from the residents, closer to I-40. You know, I don't know if that's something that the city is looking to, you know, recruit, but those seem like they're really high-paying jobs and relatively small footprint, at least based on that one example. So I'm by no means very experienced in that, but
yeah,
that, you know, that kind of thing might be a good
and
fit.
Michelle, to add to that, I think that area that you pointed out is probably right along the rail line too, right? So that has another good like plus when it comes to manufacturing, right? For ease of shipping. I still think that area, kind of that southern state trust, is just more of a residential. That, I mean, maybe some small, you know, I guess because like the golf course, I would be considered commercial, something more along those lines than having not advocating for another golf course, but just more of that residential feel in that area.
Sort of, would you say, Stephanie, like neighborhood serving commercial in a way?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
So I appreciate this group tackling both growth ideas and how we're talking about things. I think it was kind of part of maybe why we hope what we hoped when pairing them. Yeah, thank you, Jordan, for taking the lead on or taking notes, and for everyone just adding in. I think there's going to be time for us in the report back to fill in details and to react to each other's comments. So that's what will be the second half of today's meeting. If you have any other thoughts, feel free to just have them be part of the large group discussion when we get there. But I appreciate your time and patience with the whole map layer deciphering here. Anything else before we break?
If we have a minute, the one thing I'm noticing is more of a future way out long term is to the west. There's a big section of what would be state land, and you know, I'm just thinking about like how that might eventually turn into something that is, you know, both residential, commercial, employment, all of that. And you know, I'm not
Paul, are you talking about this?
all of that is appropriate for development, but just the thought of like, how do you think super long term and or kind of create a pathway?
Okay. Is this the area you were okay? All right. Yeah. Good. We got it on the board here. Okay. Well, good. And it seems to me that there's not, I mean, we focus mostly south of 40 on this conversation. So there's not really, because as we go north, we're going up into the hills and stuff too, right? So that's that's why that is there. Something, Paul, based on that, I know that we had heard some feedback and like protection around development on the west side based on like, light pollution and other things near the observatory. I know that's somewhat far off, but I don't know if there are any thoughts based on that kind of consideration.
Yeah, I think, they certainly want to maintain and continue the dark skies guidelines, and know that necessarily prevents development. I guess it makes it a little harder, but certainly, yeah. What I'm thinking about in terms of walkability and mixed density and getting things to work. At some point, the farther away you get, you want to have another center, and like, how does that kind of get created out of nothing when you're thinking long term?
Okay, great. One last question before we leave this room. I feel like a lot of our conversation was working with the current infrastructure in place as far as roadways, right? We weren't ever thinking that any other major roadways or expansion of those would change based on kind of the areas we focused on. Does that generally sound right to folks? I mean, there's a.
I guess that makes me think of the internal discussion about like traffic on to the Grand Canyon and how to mitigate that.
Okay. Well, obviously I asked a question with only 10 seconds left, but something just we can flesh out more in large group. But thanks all, and I'll see you on the other side.
All right. Hey, everybody.
Morning.
Okay. So this will be a fun live demo of Google Earth. So buckle up, because whenever we do these things live, my internet usually crashes or something else goes wildly wrong, but we're gonna do our best and see if we can make it work today. So I'm gonna share my screen. Actually, first, before I share this screen, stop share here. I'm just going to share my full screen so we can also see our presentation here. Okay, so we are going to be talking about two of the growth ideas. Growth idea number 3, which is the focus on downtown and NAU, and growth idea number 4, which is a focus on East Flagstaff. So our growth ideas largely are going to be focused within the city of Flagstaff, and probably, I mean, we can talk through them, but probably kind of circling around ideas of like infill and, less about growth into greenfield, and, finding places to grow in areas that are already fairly well established. So let me just pull up our slides here. Actually, I don't think they're, well, sure, why not? We'll pull them up. Okay. And let me share my screen again. So the way this exercise is going to work is we will be using Google Earth. Are you able to see my screen okay? I will expand the map screen in just a moment here.
Sachi?
Yeah.
Someone's having an issue recording because they're not a co-host.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Sorry, Sachi's the host for all rooms, so
1 minute here. I might have to leave this room and come back really quick. Sorry about that. I will be right back.
Yeah, no problem.
Like someone got the recording started. Great. All right. So where there's potential for growth and change to happen, because we want these scenarios to be at least somewhat reasonable and responsive to what the market's doing. So whether or not we agree with whether growth should be concentrated in rural activity centers, we want to at least think about if that were to happen, if policies and investments in the region were to go in the direction that supports that.
On the ground. Great. On the ground through this kind of Google Earth Pro map that we set up with different context layers. So I will get us acquainted with the different layers we have, but maybe the first most important question is, among these two growth ideas, is there any one in particular that you would like to start with, or maybe think is more important to spend time on? Feel free to keep yourself unmuted since it's a small group.
Well, I'm thinking greenfields
Yeah, I like that one.
as important. So
Yeah, I'll second that. Yeah.
Got lots of
I mean, so I have to pull it back up from a couple weeks, but I thought it was a good conversation. I'm I was glad to be a part of it. I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes from it. This whole process has been really, really good to be a part of. So I guess that's it for right now.
That's good. Sorry, Sachi, we were just talking about the business as usual discussion from the 24th. And
Oh, I know. I can tell you something. It really impressed upon my mind how critical this process is, because if we doing nothing and having growth occur the way it is not an option. And so that was probably my greatest takeaway, is doing nothing is the worst of all possible scenarios.
Yeah, I think we'll learn. And then we've got to figure out from here, like these discussions, we have to track, well, so what should we be doing? Right.
Right. Yeah. Now that we know that business as usual is not what we want, and it's not going to push the needle in the ways that we are hoping it will for the region, what is going to work, and how do we kind of test, we might think we know what's going to work, but how do we actually test that a little bit and prod that? And that's a big part of what the scenario planning process is about, is testing things before we actually put them into policy and programming, being able to say what would this really look like? Let's really explore it in a detailed and analytical way, so that we're quite sure that what we can expect if we are to move forward with this. So with that in mind, I'm hoping the other two groups were able to figure out their recording. And here we are. So what we want to talk about today are two growth ideas. The first one is a focus on downtown and NAU. So this one came about in particular for folks. In fact, I will say overall, what we heard in a lot of our workshops was that people actually didn't want to see a lot of growth happening, especially in the downtown area, because of a fear of change of character, and potentially density, very tall buildings, a loss of views of the mountains, all these important things. But when people were kind of pressed, especially when money or growth is low, they tended to invest in downtown first. So seeing it as a way to kind of, because there's so much infrastructure already there, you know, there's a lot of existing amenities already in that area, existing transit connections. It was a way that was seen to be pretty effective and efficient when money or growth is low. Also, if you prioritize transit or climate, people tended to build closer to downtown or in downtown more than, you know, kind of out in these sprawly patterns, or expanding in maybe unincorporated or more rural areas. So that was sort of the background of what we were seeing when people playing Face the Future Flagstaff were looking more at a focus on downtown and the NAU campus area. Sarah, anything to add to that before we move on, just in terms of sort of the story here? And we'll dive into this in the map, but I just want to give a little background on both of these first.
I think that the one thing I would say is that scenario planning is going to tell us what we can gain or achieve with this strategy. It may not give us all the details on how to make this a widely accepted strategy in the community, because I do think that character piece is something we're not going to get out of the modeling, we're going to get out of the policy translation part. So I just put that up as a reminder for the group.
Yeah. So I think any other comments or
Terry has a question in the chat.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I wasn't part of the first two meetings, so I'm sorry if I'm backing up a little bit, but I'm curious to know if when these conversations took place about downtown and downtown character, if there was a nuance that sort of separated the historic downtown from some of the more underdeveloped parts of downtown, or were people commenting on downtown as a whole? Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
I think, sure, go ahead. You can, yeah, go ahead and take a first stab, and I can add some color commentary.
Yeah, I think they were commenting on downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods as a whole. And not going that fine scale enough of saying, but maybe this site would be okay, or maybe this one.
Okay.
Okay. I think that is a next level as we kind of work down in terms of level of detail that we'll need to get into.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and the scale at which people were playing the Face the Future Flagstaff games, people were able to place growth on essentially like grid squares, and like, to give you an idea, like one grid square would maybe be the size of like half of or all of potentially downtown. I wish we could have gotten a finer grain than that, but the reality of just how the mechanics of the game worked and the physical realities of what we had to work with, like in terms of a game board and what we could bring to engagement, activities, and how we could translate the data, we just had kind of larger areas. So now we have an opportunity to play with some of the nuance of this a little bit more.
Okay,
and
so I understand.
Yeah, really, that's a really good point though, and a good sort of like reminder for us about the direction that we want to go here, and you know, kind of how detailed we want to get. So I'm curious to hear from people. Hang on, let me make sure I'm also following some questions that I have here. So in this particular growth idea, where we would be focusing on downtown and NAU, what areas do you think are more like feasible or most likely to experience change, and why? And that doesn't have to just be limited to downtown and NAU, but of course, like that might be where we would start our focus.
So is the question, where do we think, if growth was allowed around downtown NAU, where would the growth happen? Or where do you think it's wisest for it to happen?
Yes, so if we in the regional plan created sort of a future land use map and policy that encouraged and prioritized growth primarily in downtown Flagstaff and around the NAU campus, what areas do you think would likely be impacted? And the considerations could be, what would the market bear out? You know, what's actually available? Where do you think people, you know, where would there be an appetite for growth? And, you know, what might there, like, other repercussions of that type of growth be in the area?
Well, I think if it was allowed, you'd have quite a bit of growth around downtown. I mean, that's the natural pattern of city development, is to densify around the downtown core where all of the amenities are. I think Terry has something she just put in the chat that's probably smarter than what I was about to say.
Not at all. I think I'm just agreeing with what you're saying. You should continue talking for sure.
Oh, I was going to get specific. So in Southside neighborhood, and I can speak personally here because I live in Southside. My house is actually in this image. In Southside,
put a note where Tyler's house is.
Somewhere in this image. Good luck.
Kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. In Southside, I can say, because I walk through it and ride through it every day, there are quite a few undeveloped properties that are currently low density. That I think would quickly densify if they were able to, if it was easier to do so. I think you'd see a lot more things like townhomes, like the ones that Hope Construction built. They built quite a few back in 2008. I think you'd see a lot more construction like that throughout the whole neighborhood. One thing I'm a little bit uncertain though is on how this intersects with the Rio del Flag. So my understanding is that a decent chunk of Southside is actually in the Rio del Flag floodplain. And that limits the ability to build there. Like they can't get loans or insurance or something. But the Rio del Flag flood project should remove that consideration. And once that's completed, it'll be much easier to do a lot more development in that area. Someone else, please jump in and correct everything I just said there.
I think the only thing I'd say is that, so the Rio de Flag flood control project will remove floodplain regulations for the 100-year floodplain from large areas of the South Side. It has not yet been determined if it will completely remove floodplain designation or just reduce it over that blue area that Sachi had on the screen. But what that means is basically that you can build at grade and not have to elevate your construction for flood levels, which does decrease the cost of new construction and reconstruction of buildings. It wouldn't automatically change the density or the financing. People have still been getting financing for redevelopment in this area, but it would also remove the requirement to carry flood insurance. So you would not, if that blue area gets reduced and your house goes from within the blue area to outside the blue area, you no longer have to buy flood insurance. You still can buy flood insurance. And I'm sure we've seen there's lots of times where people who didn't have flood insurance or think they were in a floodplain have flooded under an increased fire and flood risk scenario of climate change. So I don't think it's very black and white. I think it's pretty nuanced, and I hope that will help in the conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
Sarah, can you remind me some of the Hope construction projects, where, or Tyler, where in the city are they, or where in the South Side are they? I remember driving by some when I've been there, but I don't know that I could easily find them now.
Yeah, so if you go to 5-3
South of Butler,
Fontaine, if you actually go south, I can show you one example that's nice. It's a 5-unit townhome.
South of Butler?
Yeah, south of Butler, Franklin, the very corner of Franklin and Fontaine.
See if I can get my street names
A
back up.
little bit more south.
Okay. Oh, here. Okay. I see Franklin.
Yeah, so I think Fontaine doesn't actually show up, but it's like right where that little pointy intersection is, where Franklin kind of diverts directions. Yeah, that upper right corner, if you zoom in, that U-shaped building.
This guy.
Yeah, so that's actually a 5-unit townhome, pretty dense. Parking is in garage. Most of the units are 1-car garages. It's sort of that classic middle missing housing. And my impression walking around Southside is that there's a ton of sites, really old, sort of dilapidated housing, that is ripe for redevelopment into that sort of denser middle missing housing.
Yeah, what do others think about that? I think, you know, I would probably agree in my own observations of walking around the area that, especially in the South Side, you know, there is certainly opportunity for infill and maybe, you know, sort of what could maybe be characterized as neighborhood improvement or gentrification even. So, you know, do we think that and that's not to paint a bad picture necessarily of infill, but just knowing that there's a historic community here, are there concerns about having infill in areas of the South Side, or does this seem like an area that would, you know, really be well fitted for some increased housing and density?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. So I have a feeling that so it's funny looking at the comments you've already given us about what people said about growth in downtown and NAU and the Southside area. The first thing you hear is we don't want to change the character and we want to limit height, which is also limiting density. I mean, that's what they're saying, right? Parking is always an issue. Gentrification comes up. But when you look at where can we infill so we don't sprawl? How do we protect natural corridors? How do we look at our growth climate plan? All of that then pushes you back to redevelopment, higher density infill. And that's what the last regional plan directed, was infill redevelopment, more density in downtown. And then when you get that density in downtown, people are pissed. And so I just find this to be an interesting topic, because it's what we say we want until we get it, and then we don't want it. And so I find this growth strategy to be incredibly divisive. And it feels like one that no matter which side you're on, whether you're pro-growth, pro-infill, pro-redevelopment, or you're like historic neighborhoods, community character, you're gonna be mad. It's just fascinating to me to watch this.
Yeah,
that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Oh, I had a thought that may be of interest to Terry. Terry, you're with the Downtown Business Alliance, right?
Yes.
If downtown is going to densify, or there's going to be more development, redevelopment around downtown, a good way to do that would be reducing the amount of required parking, because something like 20 to 30% of downtown is off-street parking. It's in smaller chunks, but overall there's quite a bit of land downtown that's just parking.
Right. And I would expect, Tyler, that those sites will develop. You know, where we have surface lots, I don't think it's ideal to keep those as parking lots. But until there is some type of sufficient parking, even as part of a project, you know, that infrastructure need is there right now. But for example, the existing surface lot where the courthouse once stood, that's not intended to remain as parking. That's intended to be developed. And I hope it will be. I'd like to see some part of it become open for parking, but all of the sites that are surface lots, in my opinion, are ripe for appropriate development. You know, so that site over by Babbitt Ford, the bank sites that are surrounded by large parking lots, all of those sites to me are opportunity sites for development. And Devana, I just want to comment, I agree with your point that this is divisive, and you know, there's a fine line that I think we have to walk with downtown and preserving character. But I also think that there is appropriate types of development. So even on these sites, I would not like to see huge multi, you know, like one giant project fill an entire block. But if there's housing that is, you know, a mixture of townhomes, or it's upper story living with ground floor retail and restaurant, I think there is an appropriate type of development for downtown that doesn't impact our historic, the historic streets like San Francisco and Aspen, but we're sort of on the outer ring of downtown where that type of development makes sense. I would like to see us try to get there with appropriate design. So I tried to comment both, Tyler, to answer you, but also, you know, I agree with Devana, but I'd love to see if in appropriate places with appropriate design, we can't begin to see some type of development happen.
About that, so Flagstaff already has design standards, and everybody seems to agree that they don't like the design of new buildings. Meanwhile, we have all of these historic buildings that were built without design standards in the zoning code, and everybody loves them. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of irony?
Were you asking me, Tyler? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you were talking about design. So we have all
I
these
mean,
historic buildings that were built without design standards, and we
yeah,
all love them. And then
well,
new buildings do have design standards, and everyone hates them.
well, I don't know that, at least in downtown, I don't hear that everybody hates. I mean, I think the one project that I hear people be unhappy with is the Hub or the Jack. But like the Marriott, that's a new development. I don't hear a lot of comments about the Marriott. You know, there's some new housing from Miramonte that's taking place on Birch. I'm not hearing concerns about Miramonte's design. I think the project that I was referring to when I said, you know, appropriate design is the Hub, even though they were able to build that, you know, it's like a monster project in terms of size, and it's not broken up in terms of design. And so it was more a comment about how not to have like a mega project overwhelm a site. But I feel like the Marriott and Miramonte are both being built without at least me hearing a ton of concern.
Yeah. Although I'm curious to interrogate the thing about the Hub a bit more, because I actually spend quite a bit of time on that street because my bicycle shop is there. And you've got that brewery, and then the Toasted Owl Cafe right across the street. people talk about the hub like it destroyed the area, but every time I go to that street, it's full of people enjoying themselves.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I was just commenting that that's where I heard concern from others. But I agree. I mean, that corner is a really active corner. I love the use. I love the people. I love, the outdoor amenities. It's just that when I hear comments, there was a lot of concern about the design being such a monster project.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. It's a really active corner.
Yeah.
And I
just
love,
ask because
I
I'm
love
always
the
kind
use.
I'm always kind of sus of complaints versus going there and are people actually using the space and seem to be having fun. Like it's sort of which one's more real. But yeah, I do get the thing about these sort of larger developments taking up an entire block. Although I have some thoughts on that. My understanding is that this pattern of development where a single developer comes in and redevelops an entire block can be a side effect of very restrictive and complex zoning. And the reason is if the zoning is very strict, if it's very complex, if you need a rezoning and the rezoning process is very complex, all of that translates into time, money, and lawyers, which only the larger developers are going to have access to. The smaller guys aren't going to have the resources to muddle through the process. Yeah, so a sort of complex zoning code like we have can give a marginal benefit to the larger developers. Do you have any thoughts on that? You may have more experience with that than me. This is all academic to me.
So I'm going to think on that one, and
Okay.
I will have some thoughts, but I'm going to think on that one.
Okay.
I have two sites, Sachi, I want to ask questions about that we've been
Can I,
talking about.
before you do that, Sarah, can I just confirm, I'm remembering this and now ground truthing it on Google Maps here to make sure this is the hub and the jack area, right? And thanks, Genevieve, thanks for pointing out, you're right, this imagery we're using, I'm using because it has this 3D capability where we can go in at this oblique angle and look, but I realize the Marriott and the hub are not, it looks like they're still being built here. We can look at some more recent photos, but they're just aerial imagery. So I'm not really able to do like the zooming around. So maybe we'll just like toggle between those things. But yeah, thanks for very true that is, this is a little dated now. I also, before we go to your sites, Sarah, thank you. I noted the comments about the hub and the jack. And you were talking about a parking lot. Terry, are you referring to this parking lot here?
It's actually to the right. Yes, that right.
This one here. Okay.
Yeah. So those two buildings that you see on that site have come down.
Right.
And,
okay. I thought this was all empty last time I was there.
So what you have when you look at those four sort of quarter blocks, current conditions are 3/4, the top two, and then the one on the bottom right are all surface lot right now today. The one on the bottom left is like a pawn shop and a roadway in. That still remains. So 3/4 at a minimum, 3/4 of that block is currently surface parking. Some is hotel only, some is public. That site is, I think, one of the most prime opportunities for redevelopment in downtown. So it sort of addresses Tyler's comment about surface parking. It's not ideal at all. And here you have at least 3/4 of a block that serves as the gateway into downtown that could be redeveloped. And I think it should.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just noticing the time as well. This is a really good conversation, so I'm hesitant to interrupt us, but I also do want to talk about East Flagstaff. So maybe Genevieve, I see your hand up, so let's go ahead and hear from you, and then we'll move to East Flagstaff after that.
Actually, I have one question I want folks to answer. I just took my hand down because you said I was going next, but early when you put the growth idea 3 comment 2 down, Tyler was talking about areas of the south side that could be redeveloped. So I was going to put the sub areas from their neighborhood plan for the south side in the chat. Maybe people can email or follow up on this and we don't have to discuss it right now, but I'd like to know if people think about in this group, they're having this discussion, think about those areas, because the way the south side approached infill and what we're talking about here is the blue areas on that map are the ones where they said put density in big buildings and lot consolidation in this area. The orange, the like striped areas are where they thought historic preservation should be focused, which is not a huge section of the community. And then they have sort of a mid, moderate, and low density in different parts of the neighborhood, which sort of counters some of the things where I think Tyler was saying housing is dilapidated. One of the reasons they identified that area for protection was displacement concerns. So I think that that's where to me, this map that I put in the chat kind of lays out where we would have highest controversy for seeing increases in density and where they'd be moderate or low based on the neighborhood plan. So we don't have to answer that now, but maybe just put that pin in your head and think about emailing me thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think the displacement is kind of a rock in a hard place. So if we don't build anything at all, you're going to continue the pattern you see right now, which is where prices and rents keep going up, and you mostly have students displacing people out of single family homes that are being rented. But again, yeah, if you do redevelop, you may be tearing down a single housing unit, but it's very old and it's dilapidated, and because of its condition, it's affordable. But then the person who lived there before doesn't have a place to go to. And so, yeah, it's kind of a rock in a hard place.
All right.
Thanks, Sarah and Tyler. I just wanted to add real quick before we go back to the 4th Street area is, and Sarah, you mentioned in the South Side plan, some sites want larger buildings and some areas want to preserve existing housing stock. And I think just one thing that's probably relevant to this conversation, although it might be more detailed than where in terms of thinking about growth here, but I think a lot of it just depends on what type of development goes different places. I mean, I think people didn't like the hub because it's so big, and there's also these questions about the zoning code. I mean, it looks a certain way now, but it could look a different way in the future, which could create different types of development patterns. I mean, Tyler mentioned design standards, parking. We talked about alleys, combining parcels, pedestrian connectivity. Like there's so many things that, we have kind of the zoning code business as usual right now. Basically, what does development look like with our current zoning code? But if it were to change, it could look very different. So I think that is relevant to this conversation. It's very detailed and more detailed than I think we can get into right now, or really would get into in this process anyway. But I think it's an important thing to think about that, I think we all agree business as usual doesn't look good. And so moving forward, part of that is updating the zoning code too. So it's not just zoning code business as usual, but hopefully this will help inform that. But I think that would make a big impact on where people want to see growth in terms of what kind of development could actually go there and what kind of zoning code changes would be needed to enable that.
Yeah. How much time do we have? Because I had an example to talk through actually, and I also wanted to throw a bomb out there. What about adding more housing to the town site overlay area? That's 70 acres right next to downtown.
Here?
No, it's between Thorpe Park and downtown. There's like 70 acres there. South of Thorpe Park.
Yeah, like this area, yeah.
I can help with mapping later, Sachi, just to
Okay.
keep you facilitating conversation. So I put that down as just a note. I don't think we'll have time to answer it because we do only have a couple minutes and we haven't talked about 4th Street yet.
Yeah, thank you. Genevieve, I wonder if in the comments too, and others, if you could also maybe kind of let me know a little bit more when you say that the hub was too big, is it height that was the issue, or like the actual amount of block space that it takes, or like what's the issue with scale there? Just in the chat, if you don't mind. So let's move over to 4th. Let me find my slides here. So this growth idea focuses on East Flagstaff and people in particular actually who are interested in prioritizing affordable housing placed a lot of residential pieces here. There were also comments about areas like 4th Street having a lot of potential for commercial and retail growth. So I'm curious to hear what folks think about this area and growth here, and what areas might experience the most growth or change if we were to prioritize and focus growth in this area.
I'd want to hear from Devana on this, if that helps you call on someone, because I feel like you're the subject matter expert on Sunnyside, 4th Street, Greenlaw area.
Sorry, I have to admit that I was distracted with something else. So what was the question? Crap.
So we're looking at the potential for, if in our regional plan and in our policies for the future, the next 20 years or so, we wanted to focus on the east side. Some comments have been made in public meetings about wanting to focus affordable housing in this area, and also that 4th Street has a lot of potential for retail and commercial kind of expansion or increasing. And I'm curious to hear where people might think that would happen. Like, we could talk about literal actual parcels, or we could talk about maybe bigger picture areas, sections, and if there's any concerns with growth happening in this area.
So I think this is a great area for redevelopment, infill, and higher density. There is already some infrastructure through 4th Street. It is a main corridor. You're seeing redevelopment or development actually south of Route 66 between the tracks right there. So that's kind of all new development through there. I agree with Tyler's point that, a lot of this is not pedestrian friendly. It's not walkable. It's not dense. It's a lot of parking. There's, the car prevails through here. I think if you're looking at redevelopment on the east side of 4th Street, where it's commercial right now, there's a lot of opportunity. If you do look at redevelopment on the west side of 4th Street, you're looking at a low-income target neighborhood. And I think you're going to have similar pushback to what you see in South Side as far as displacement goes, or relocation of folks who are lower income. But you see the same opportunity, right? Dilapidated structures, abandoned structures, old structures. So I agree with Tyler's point about, they might be affordable options, but are they safe? Are they decent? And can we redevelop maybe some larger tracts into higher density housing that would be decent and affordable, but how do you mitigate relocation and impacts of displacement? So I see this as a great opportunity for redevelopment.
Other thoughts or concerns about or seconding Devana's thought that this is a great opportunity for redevelopment. You know, even though we know there might be some possibility for displacement, you know, potentially there's policy measures that we could take to mitigate some of that. I know there's also concerns around flooding in this area, especially in the residential areas. And I'm hearing concerns about the sort of infrastructure, the existing infrastructure as well. We have some boundaries here showing things like sidewalks. Is there particular infrastructure you feel like is lacking here? Is it transit? Is it sidewalks? Is it literal like utility infrastructure?
I would say there's a lack of things to do in the area. First I'll second what Devana said. I love how eloquent she is in stating all of this, sort of aspire to that sort of ease. But this whole strip you're looking at, and you can even tell looking at it from above, there's like just this huge block of parking. So contrast that to downtown, or the southern part of downtown. Like I'll often go there on the weekends just to kind of hang out, because there's always stuff to do downtown, and there's tons of people just walking around and hanging out at Heritage Square, at Thorpe Park, at the shops and stuff. Meanwhile, so I actually work across the street, right across the bridge on 4th Street, and I walk across the bridge into that section you were looking at to get lunch oftentimes. It's so hostile. It's just these massive parking lots that are in between you and the actual shops. And yeah, it's a terrible experience walking down through there. Like I would never go to that area and just hang out and look around the way I do downtown. And it's mostly because of all that dead space there. Oh, dead space and a lack of shade. Should throw that in too. Downtown has a lot of shade from both the buildings and from trees and the park and whatnot. There's none of that in that area.
So it sounds like maybe some of the issues are around urban design and a lack of activation of the area and the public, especially the public spaces.
Yeah, which I think
or quasi-public spaces.
Yeah, which I think there's an opportunity to both densify and greatly improve the character of that area. At least for that major strip along 4th Street.
Okay. Great. All right, I'm gonna wrap up all of our groups here. While I'm doing that, any last comments or thoughts?
I have one comment to add about 4th. And I will say I do see a lot of really great opportunity, especially for affordable housing. I echo everything Devana said. I think there's a different dynamic sort of underlying what's going on 4th Street, and other people know this more than I do. There have been a lot of attempts to try to do some things to slow traffic on 4th or to add beautification elements. And there has actually been resistance from the existing property owners. And so that, I mean, it may be great for us to look at this and talk about 4th Street and all the opportunity. But right now, at least from what I'm hearing, property owners don't want it. And other people at the city know more than I do, like I said, but that should be a consideration, is just seeing how to maybe engage property owners.
Yeah, I think you're correct. There's been multiple attempts. There are 2 or 3 property owners who own enough of 4th Street that they can block anything they don't like. And they don't like having to maintain anything. So they actually don't mind if they build it. They just don't actually want to maintain any of it or pay any additional taxes to see it maintained. So they're not interested in TIFs. They're not interested in a lot of the solutions. I know you, Terry, as the DBA director, know a lot about we've just never gotten traction on any of those conversations. So there's some philosophy and players who own enough to hold up anything you dream.
All right, let's head back to the main room. Thanks, everybody. All right, well, thank you, everybody. That was a whirlwind, at least for our group. Definitely not enough time as always, but I think we had some really good conversations. Hopefully everyone's trickling back. So let's take about 3 minutes to use the restroom, get some water, get up and stretch your legs, and we will come back at 11:20. Buddy, for coming back so quickly. All right, so we've got about 40 minutes, a little less than 40 minutes to talk about what we just talked about as a group. So we had quite a few, we had 6 growth ideas to talk through, and each of us in our individual breakout rooms talked about 2 of these ideas. So now the idea is to come back as a group and kind of recap what we talked about. Each group will have about 10 minutes to talk about what they discussed, and I'm hoping the note takers can help maybe lead that discussion and bring others that were in your group into highlight things as well. So let's just start. We'll go sort of chronologically here with room number 1. I believe this was Steiny and Jess facilitating and note-taking, and you all talked about rural activity centers and prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards. 2 interesting growth ideas to pair together. So my question for you is, what areas did you identify as most likely to experience change in your growth ideas, and why? And we'll leave it at that, and then we can go to question 2.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So just restating what I heard, there was we have sort of an interesting clash of realities and what was heard from local residents versus what we heard in the workshops. And so by that I mean, in the Face the Future workshops, we heard a lot of people saying they wanted to see more growth in some of these outlying areas. They wanted to see more commercial services so that there would be options for people to get some of their needs met without going into Flagstaff. But on the reality side of it, there's very limited infrastructure to support that in most of these communities, it sounds like. That's on the roads side of it. For instance, in Belmont, there's not a available land for another interchange to support more development there. Kachina Village is mostly built out. And then on the side of what the local residents seem to say they want, in some of the recently adopted area plans there, for instance, in Doney Park, there was a desire to keep things very, very rural. And so that kind of goes against what we heard in the workshops. So we're going to have to really think about how to optimize that in a scenario. And then we also had another comment in our discussion that growth in these areas also seems to clash with a lot of the growth principles that were elevated in the survey. So protecting growth or restricting growth in the wildland urban interface, meeting our climate goals, those sorts of things, they're hard to square with growth in these outlying areas. So I think what we're finding is that, or what we seem to discuss a lot, is that in these areas, the opportunities for growth are going to be pretty limited in reality. There may be some opportunities to add a couple of commercial uses to make these more fully amenitized communities. but generally there's not a ton of change that's possible in a lot of these places. One interesting side note that we did get into is that the Navajo Nation has been buying up a good amount of land along Cosnino Road on the east side of Flagstaff, outside of the city boundary, south of Doney Park. There's an interchange there, which is a pretty big deal, could make development possible there. And we talked about the possibility for housing there, specifically for people who now commute from the Navajo Nation into Flagstaff for work. Maybe there are opportunities for a new community there to house some of those folks, make their commutes a bit shorter. Anything on that? Anything anyone else from that group wants to add in that I may have missed?
We mentioned about Cosnino the issue of water supply, because Flagstaff doesn't currently provide water service there, and that would be expensive. So it's just another infrastructure issue. I think there's just the overall theme of the conversation felt like this is going to be there are a lot of barriers to large scale growth outside of the established city center. And I think that fits a lot of themes that we're seeing in other parts of the country too, or other parts of the state. We're kind of entering a phase of where the established communities that already have the infrastructure are the ones that are able to grow. Mm-hmm. Same issues here.
I have a question in our last minute or two with you all. Do you feel like there's anything about this scenario or this growth idea that needs to be brought forward in some way into a alternative scenario? Is there something of value we should carry forward, or does this feel like kind of a almost a moot point, like, it's just not possible, and it maybe doesn't match with enough of the principles that we've identified, and it's not feasible enough for us to actually really pursue it? Is there anything in there that we should pull out and try to bring forward?
I don't know. I think if there's land that becomes available at the at Camp Navajo or with the Navajo Housing Authority over at Cosnino, those still seem like viable options to me, even if they are relatively, of a relatively low likelihood.
I wonder if there were a scenario to emerge that featured this growth idea very heavily, I think it would be instructive as a way to create a trade-off between really, unrealistic as it may be, the need for a really different way in which we spend money to build infrastructure. Like, if you want to do this, it's going to take a ton of money that we don't have. And just sort of bringing that conversation to the fore. Do people think there's value in having that conversation?
I actually strongly agree with that, because I think that's just really good communication. Often what we're dealing with as experts, technical experts in public forums, is a public that doesn't understand, doesn't have a perspective on costs and benefits and feasibility. And so often the perfect ends up being the enemy of the good there, which is just my way of saying, yes, putting the unlikely or very expensive options on the list is a good idea, if only to highlight how much better the preferred options are and to educate people. It puts it in perspective.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that, and I want to add that it also should be in terms of, if you really want this, this is what it's going to take. and this includes your support in this way. This is what it's going to be necessary to have that amount of money to make these things happen.
Okay, great.
If I can
Thank
just
you.
add too, we have really struggled, I think, to talk about the cost of development as a community, right? Especially development in outlying areas. And so I just, from a historical perspective about like these conversations, I just thanks Ben and Roxana.
All right, so let's move on to room number 2. So room number 2 talked about urbanizing Flagstaff greenfield sites and attracting large employers. And a reminder, each group has about 10 minutes. So room number 2, what areas did you identify as most likely to experience change in your growth ideas? And how well did the growth ideas stack up against the priority growth principles we talked about?
All right, so I'll take a stab at kind of summarizing what room 2 discussed. So in terms of the greenfield sites, the group, we kind of started out having some general discussion just about what land is, like what greenfield sites might be available. So we kind of landed on several pieces of state trust land that we kind of have identified in the past as being available for future development. So that includes certainly around the new hospital site now, along the new JWP alignment, and then the state trust parcel that's south, kind of east of the country club area. And there was another, we identified another parcel kind of along I-40 on the east side of town that we seemed like a good opportunity for particularly commercial development. I wasn't so familiar with that site, so maybe that is less feasible than the group thinks. But yeah, sorry, I'm waiting for catch up on the map here. Yeah, so certainly down by where the new hospital site has been identified. Oh, Julie just put a comment that the 405 acres shown as state land on JWP was auctioned off to Symmetry Partners, Pine Canyon owners.
Sachi, if it's easier, I could share my screen to show the areas we're talking about, but also.
Yeah, thanks.
So just to complement what Jordan was saying, we found areas around the airport and new hospital site, and even longer term growth in this state lands. And then Jordan was saying, around this country club area that's kind of adjacent to the JWP alignment. And then this was the parcel that kind of straddles 66 that we talked about. Employment and potential light manufacturing kind of area, or possibility for light manufacturing. I think we kind of tackled both growth ideas at once when we were talking about greenfield sites and looking at what were opportunities for what made most sense, given that a lot of the development, in the area, we have a lot more residential here. And so if you were to place any large employers, it would actually have to come with perhaps some significant, infrastructure upgrades and connection with roads. So that'd be one growth principle that would kind of be in conflict with some of the areas we identified if we wanted to really bolster them to attract larger employers or see them as larger employment centers. And so, sorry, Jordan, I didn't mean to butt in, but
nope, I think that was what I was going to say. So thanks.
Others from the group, were there other things we wanted to highlight as far as kind of key takeaways or key discussion points? Okay. We did such a great job at summarizing it. Stephanie, Michelle, Paul, Chris, Jenny. Okay.
I was just wondering if Julie could identify that 405 acres and describe anything about the nature of that development.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same.
I certainly can. So it's the L-shaped, the tan L-shaped parcel. Yep. Right there where your cursor is. So that was auctioned off in, yeah, that's it's interesting. They haven't updated their data because that was auctioned off in, it's been a couple of years now, to Symmetry Partners in partnership with Capstone. Capstone is the developer of Canyon del Rio. Symmetry is the owner of Pine Canyon. They are collaborating with the property owners along that corridor, JWP. So it would be the Gibson family, Little America, and the Brighton family, to do an area plan that's centered on the JWP corridor. And the city is also engaging in a specific area plan along that corridor. I think initial indication is that it's Symmetry Partners and Capstone, and their desire, there's also the Rio that runs through there. A significant amount of that is drainage way. And there's also the Arizona Trail that goes through there and some considerable wildlife corridors. So there's actually not a lot of developable area in that zone with those resources and kind of those special hazard areas. Oh, thanks. But Symmetry, Capstone. So you can kind of see the trajectory of, what they can do by right, or what they are going to look to possibly rezone to do. Mm-hmm. It'll be an interesting one to watch in the next year.
Thanks, Julie. One other thing I wanted to add that I think Stephanie brought up was when we were talking about what kinds of employers we want to bring, would Flagstaff benefit from bringing in, and we focused on more healthcare, specialized healthcare, maybe ones that are complementary to the, all of the resources that make Flagstaff a destination for elite athletes and training, so more sports medicine and things like that. Also some real basic needs like pediatrics. So that was kind of one of the other large employer kind of areas that we discussed briefly. Okay, I think that's it in a nutshell.
So I'm curious, we have a couple more minutes here. I just wanted to reshare the growth principles, the top 5 priority growth principles. Curious to hear from this group. You mentioned a few maybe potential synergies here, but do you feel like either or both of your growth ideas really support this set of 5 priority growth principles? Do you think either of them are at odds with this in any way?
Is this for both of the first 2 breakout rooms?
I was talking to breakout room 2, but if you have something you want to share, feel free.
No, I mean, we touched on this, that ours, at least the grow in rural activity centers, often seems to be at odds with some of these. Right.
Yeah. I'm curious in particular for group 2, if you talked about the ability or, affordability in workforce housing, and how that would play, knowing that we'd be in at least one, if not both of your scenarios, bringing in new jobs and likely new residents with those jobs. If you thought about how that would play with the stock of affordable and workforce housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually focused, I think the one growth principle that we identified as a conflict might be the traffic congestion. If we were trying to be mindful of areas that we identified, greenfield sites, and as well as kind of greenfield sites that are opportune for large employers or employment centers, we were trying to be careful with not having to impact like traffic and flow and connectivity, or the kind of traffic congestion that might come with that. So that's also why we kind of landed on the areas we did, is because there's already infrastructure in place. We didn't talk too much about workforce housing, and I think the other growth principles weren't as much of a factor in kind of the discussion. But please, room 2 counterparts, please jump in if you have other off the cuff thoughts.
I'm curious. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, this is Michelle. I was thinking about the wildland urban interface and increasing that. And when we talk about JW Powell, that seems like it definitely increases that. And possibly the area over by, between the hospital and I-40 would also increase that area. Thanks.
I'm curious about the maximize the availability of workforce and affordable housing principle. Looking at what's happening or what's poised to happen in the John Wesley Powell area, these developers are luxury home developers for the most part. What is the opportunity? What's still on the table to get multifamily market rate housing at a minimum, or even affordable housing in that area? Is there any ability, like, does the city have the ability to pick up some land in that area, or is it all spoken for?
Tyler, this is Genevieve. I can respond to that a little bit. Having recently been a planner with the city. So there is a parcel that's zoned MH, or manufactured housing. It's right across from Pine Canyon on the north side of JW Powell. The city took ownership of that parcel as part of the Pine Canyon development back in the early 2000s. It hasn't been developed yet, probably, I believe, due to infrastructure issues. But as that whole area develops, some of that stuff will probably go away. In terms of getting affordable housing, so I believe the zoning primarily on, maybe entirely or primarily on that 405 acres is rural residential or something low density. I don't believe there's any high density residential. So the only way that there would be any other development patterns is if there was a rezoning.
Great. Thank you, room 2. So our final group is my room 3. And we talked about focusing on downtown and NAU and focusing on East Flagstaff. So the areas that we talked about, mostly fell within city, or I think entirely fell within city limits, and are areas that are already relatively built out and would likely just be, experiencing kind of more infill type development. Maybe some redevelopment, definitely some potential for gentrification, displacement concerns. One of the major concern, or a major concern that was acknowledged at the very least in both East Flagstaff and downtown and NAU area, in particular the Southside neighborhood, is gentrification and displacement, as well as loss of community character. That's felt particularly strongly in the downtown Flagstaff area. So, San Francisco and some of these other kind of historic streets. We noted, though, that there's, while it's already pretty built out, there is a lot of opportunity for both redevelopment and, kind of infill. There's a lot of surface parking still that's maybe underutilized, despite the fact that there are a lot of visitors down here, and there is a need for parking. I think there's still probably more surface parking than is needed. So there's opportunity there. There's also opportunity just for kind of generally just densifying more in general. And my Google Earth crashed and I lost all my notes. I'm trying to find some of the Hope construction sites. I think it's right here. We're looking at some recent developments that are a little bit more dense, but don't like drastically change the character of the neighborhood, like this Hope construction development that happened just, within the last 10 years or so. We also looked at some developments that have been a little controversial. One of which, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, right here. Tyler and Sarah, you'll have to remind me the name. Is this the hub, right? The hub and the jack. And it's actually not pictured on here right now, but it's, about a good like square block size, newer development. Let me see if I can get it on our time. Yeah, here it is. It's kind of hard to see on there, but larger new development. And there's been some concerns that this is just too big for the neighborhood and doesn't quite, I guess, maybe fit the character, but also folks in our group are saying they do see it get used a lot. It's pretty active. There's a lot of people there eating, drinking. There's some great restaurants. So sounds like the concerns about, character in the area are not always substantiated. Like sometimes people are actually going and patronizing places, going to eat and drink and hang out at places that are also maybe kind of seen as like, the new kid on the block and maybe kind of different than what you would see in historic downtown. So maybe some of the concern around community character is also just people having to kind of get used to things and accept them a little bit. We talked in East Flagstaff about some of the concerns about just kind of a lack of walkability. Some of these areas along 4th Street here being just kind of not very pleasant to be in because of a lack of tree canopy, a lot of surface parking that doesn't make walking feel very fun or approachable. The scale of the blocks here feels kind of big, so maybe some urban design issues that could be addressed and some density that could be increased here to maybe create a more active space. My group, anything to add about what we talked about?
I think you summarized it well. Yeah, just in these areas, there's definitely a lot of dead space that could be redeveloped. So it's a way to add density to these areas while simultaneously improving the character of the area. And then on the displacement concerns, so a lot of these communities, there are underutilized and sort of dilapidated properties that are sort of ripe for redevelopment, but there is the displacement concern. However, it's a bit of a rock and a hard place because if you don't build any housing at all, you're going to continue to see displacement through rising rents. Like in Southside, for example, you see a lot of displacement via students as rents continue to rise in the area due to a lack of housing. But of course, if you redevelop, you may be taking away a property from someone who lives there. And it is affordable to them, maybe in part because the property is old and dilapidated, so it doesn't command as high of a rent. So a bit of a rock and a hard place there for displacement, but there are properties that are sort of ideal for redevelopment.
Yeah, so I think our big takeaway was that there, while we understand that there's concerns about change in character and just infill in general, like leading to increased density that, people might not be comfortable with in the area, that there is a fair amount of room still for growth in downtown and the east side, but it would definitely have to be kind of managed and have policies around it that would ensure both kind of livability and walkability, and that these are places that are actually like benefiting the community, and also that concerns around displacement are addressed and hopefully mitigated in some way. Does anyone from the group want to talk about how our growth ideas relate to the growth principles? Anybody want
I
to take a
think you
stab at
missed
that?
2 things from the notes, Sachi. One was the banks along Birch Street. Around that there's a series of banks north of the tracks along Birch that we kind of talked about it in the chat, but not out loud as much because there's a lot to talk about in the downtown. But Terry had pointed out that along Birch, there's a series of these very low rise banks with large parking lots. There's Chase, and what's the other one? BB something, BBVA, and a few others.
National Bank, and then BBVA. There's a series of 3.
And what did you want to say about those, Terry? I just wanted us to not move on before hitting.
Well, I appreciate it, Sarah. I had just brought up that site, those 3 bank sites on the north side of Birch. There's Chase, National Bank, and BBVA. One, it's an old banking model. I think that you have a building surrounded by a block or half a block of surface parking. If you look at those together, it's a great opportunity for housing. It doesn't conflict with any of the historic buildings. So to me, it makes some sense that we could possibly get some housing and some gentle density on those sites. And then the other was the east part of downtown over by Babbitt Ford. There's several blocks that are very underdeveloped. Whether it's parking for Babbitt Ford or you have surface lots associated with the post office, and it just seems to scream opportunity. Again, not conflicting with the historic nature of sort of the core of downtown, and you're not conflicting with any neighborhoods. And I don't think there's a displacement issue with either of those sites. Thanks.
All right. Thank you to our group. So in these final 7 minutes or so, I wanted to talk through, like, what do we actually think about how these scenarios could play together? Or I'm sorry, not scenarios, growth ideas. But what do we think, which of these growth ideas might be able to combine in a scenario, as sort of building blocks to create a scenario, and which maybe might be kind of at odds with each other. And sorry, bear with me while my PowerPoint is loading here.
I'll start. So the way it turned out, the regional development outside of Flagstaff discussion ended up complementing the focusing on NAU and downtown very nicely, because the regional development discussion came up with a lot of reasons why regional development is hard. So you could combine the two. They seem like natural enemies, but actually they turned out not to be.
Yeah, maybe another way to frame that is that the path, what results from being really efficient with the funds that we have to spend on things like infrastructure results in that scenario. that you have you're taking the path of least resistance from the perspective of public dollars. And if you wanted to go against that path of least resistance, maybe you could have a scenario that has more of that growth outside of Flagstaff happening. Ben, would you agree with that statement?
Unmute. Yes.
All right.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, that wasn't a dramatic pause. Sorry. Yeah, and that's more or less all there is to it. There's limited money. The money's mostly coming from the city, and most of the infrastructure and the lower costs are in the city. So it just really and most of the hazards are outside of the city. So it just really limits the cost effectiveness and also the total amount of new development that you can support in the outlying areas. It's still going to happen, but it'll happen more ad hoc and not in a planned and well infrastructured way.
Looks like
exactly. I think to Ben's point, it's kind of limited to there's a cap on the density, right? And that cap is set primarily by your ability to put a septic system in, because there's no one who is capable of putting the debt together to finance, proper wastewater treatment infrastructure.
Just to underscore that point, in case anybody's saying, I'm not sure about that, Flagstaff might not even be able to support its own wastewater and water infrastructure, right? Let alone expanding to new areas. We're looking at $500 million in just maintenance and capital replacement costs for our existing water treatment and wastewater treatment plants. That's already on the menu, and that's not new growth. That's just maintenance and replacement. And I mean, our recent budget fights in Flagstaff have been over $20 million here, 70 million there as the big items on the list. That's $500 million, right? Without even doing new growth in new areas.
So group one, I don't think we really got to hear from you much about the growth idea of prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards. And I know those were ideas that were very important, or they were growth principles that relate to those that were very important to people in the survey. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on which growth ideas that growth idea, prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards, might work best with.
And that's my fault because we really ran out of time talking about that one. But because we are now running out of time for this meeting, I'll just say that we think it applies to all of them. And maybe as a way to measure scenario performance, that's probably the best use of that growth idea. We don't have a lot of good mechanisms for restricting growth in all of the places where there are hazards, and there are many of them. We talked a lot about post-fire flooding and how it'd be great if we could limit development in all low-lying areas, but functionally, how do we do that? But maybe we can show that if you focus your very limited public dollars in places like downtown or East Flagstaff, as opposed to outside of Flagstaff or in some of these greenfield areas, you can end up developing in less sensitive areas. And so maybe that's a good way to sort of de facto stay out of those hazard areas. If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Well, the only thing I wanted to add, this is Carpenter, we were in the meeting and I was wrapping up and we got sucked out, was that although some of these goals or policy ideas are viewed as challenges, it could also be viewed as an opportunity. For instance, building on the John Wesley Powell corridor could offer the opportunity to heavily thin all those trees, change the actual way we measure trees, count trees, and save trees, and offer a fire protection buffer to the city instead of just saying, those are wooded areas, let's be gentle and kind to them. It can be thought of the opposite way. Let's heavily thin them, make them healthy first. Our forests are overgrown in Flagstaff. Then take out the trees for the development and then offer ourselves some permanent protection. So just an idea on how to think of that a little differently.
It's a really good point. Development as hazard mitigation, proactive hazard mitigation. It's sort of a forest fire and forest oriented version of the low impact development that we practice with stormwater. actually improving the situation rather than trying to avoid it.
Can I add just one really quick thing? And somebody in our team said, and I thought it was really powerful and could be something that can be implemented everywhere as a way to message what needs to happen, and that is that we have to assume the forest is going to burn. So how are we going to prepare for that? How are we going to react to that? That's it.
Great. Well, thank you everyone
Did
for the comments
anyone-
here.
Oh.
Oh, sorry, one last thing.
Yeah, I apologize. Did anyone, this is low hanging fruit, but did anyone already mention the synergy between the developed downtown and NAU and the preserve natural areas, those two scenarios? Like there's an obvious synergy there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of what I was getting at is like, if we focus on a downtown NAU scenario, we're probably going to stay out of some of those areas that are most hazardous. So yeah, noted for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks everyone for all your comments and your feedback today. I know it never seems like we have enough time, even when we have 2 hours together, but really appreciate the feedback that you're able to give. And if you have any follow-up questions or comments, feel free to reach out to Sarah, Melissa, other city or county staff that you're in contact with, and they can pass that along to us as well. Some upcoming events that I wanted to share this week. We have a public webinar, June 15th. If you could share that webinar, Sarah, maybe do you want to, is that something we've advertised on the website? Maybe you can put the link for folks to share that with their networks. There will also be a recording of that up, you know, for posterity. So if folks can't make it on the 15th, that'll be available throughout the life of this project. There will be a public open house June 26th. So if you know, folks from the public that aren't familiar with this project that are interested in hearing about it and getting more involved, that's a great option for them to attend. And Sarah and her team will be leading that effort. And then most importantly, maybe to this group, is that we do have a Tag 5 meeting that we are currently trying to schedule in July, possibly early August as well. So keep an eye out for some dates coming through for that. We'll probably be sending out some type of a doodle poll. And that will be our final meeting for the summer. And we're going to be putting our heads down and doing some scenario modeling before coming back to you in the fall for scenario choosing. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Sarah or others, any last, from our core team, any last comments or thoughts?
Thank you, and have a wonderful lunch.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.